The helicopter's engines roared as it tried to pass through the wall of gray clouds. Inside, the pilot gripped the controls, straining to see anything through the window. He was flying blind. There was only one thing for it. He had to climb. Suddenly, a hillside appeared out of the mist. The helicopter slammed into it, erupting in a fireball and killing all on board, including an NBA legend. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll uncover what really happened to Kobe Bryant's helicopter on that fateful day. Kobe Bryant woke early on the morning of Sunday, the 26th of January, 2020. While he was a devout Catholic who would normally go to church every Sunday, today was different. He and his daughter Gianna had to be at the John Wayne Airport to catch a 9 a.m. helicopter flight. He didn't have time to attend Mass that morning, but he did have time to pray. As the local priest prepared for the 7 a.m. Mass, he ran into Kobe, who had a small amount of holy water on his forehead. After exchanging a few words, Kobe headed home to pick up Gianna and then on to John Wayne Airport. The reason for their flight that day was because of a basketball tournament at the Mamba Sports Academy owned by Bryant. The tournament was a 2-day-long event, and Gianna's team, the Mamba Ballers, were due to headline the day's games. Thousand Oaks was roughly an 80-mile drive from Kobe's in Newport Beach. The route went through some of the most congested roads in the country and took at least 2 hours to complete. The helicopter ride would take roughly 30 to 40 minutes and avoid any lengthy tailbacks. And on today's trip, there would be more than just the Bryants on board. As they arrived at the airport, 2 of Gianna's teammates were already waiting, Alyssa Altobelli and Peyton Chester, along with their parents, John and Carrie Altobelli and Sarah Chester. Also among the group was Christina Mauser, an assistant coach for the Mamba Ballers. As the families chatted, on the tarmac the helicopter was being prepped for takeoff. Piloted by Ara Zobayan, the helicopter was a 1991 Sikorsky S-76B owned by Island Express, a charter company that's offered rides throughout Orange County and the surrounding areas. At 9:06 a.m., after Zobayan had completed his pre-flight checklists, the party were given the clearance for takeoff. Due to poor weather conditions, Zobayan couldn't take his normal route, which was like a straight shot over the Hollywood Hills to Thousand Oaks. Instead, he was going to follow some of the major highways in the area. Going from Newport Beach, he followed I-5 to the northwest at a speed of about 150 knots. During this leg, he changed his altitude between 500 feet and 950 feet to avoid the area's mountainous terrain. At 9:20, Zobayan contacted the air traffic control at Burbank Airport, requesting clearance through their airspace. But because of an incoming craft, Zobayan circled in a holding pattern just outside of the airport until getting clearance. However, he asked a question that would be a harbinger of things to come. He asked the air traffic controller for a cloud tops report. This information, which comes out in the daily weather report, describes how high clouds are that day. Visibility that day had been around 3 miles, but looked to be decreasing to around 1 to 2 miles in some areas. Flying above the clouds would be a way to avoid the decreased visibility. At 9:32, Zobayan received clearance and the helicopter continued north. It continued to follow I-5 until entering Van Nuys airspace at 9:35. Zobayan intended to follow US Route 101 that would end at the Camarillo Airport, a 20-minute drive from the Mamba Sports Academy. After banking to the south, Zobayan advised the Van Nuys air traffic control that he was flying using visual flight rules and was dropping his altitude to around 500 feet to stay below the clouds. This would prevent Zobayan from flying into foul weather, which would severely reduce his visibility. By going low, he avoided flying solely by instrument flight rules, where a pilot relies on what their aircraft is telling them versus what they can see out the window. This was not authorized by either the FAA or Island Express. However, the conditions were getting worse by the minute. A camera caught a glimpse of the helicopter as it flew over US 101 and into a giant wall of clouds. It was the last image captured before the disaster. Zobayan radioed air traffic control that he was going to start his climb to get above the cloud layers. Zobayan pulled back on the controls, beginning an aggressive rate of ascent. The helicopter went from 470 feet above the ground to 1,600 feet in just over 30 seconds. Suddenly and without warning, the helicopter began increasing speed and banking hard to the left away from the highway. Noticing something was wrong, air traffic control radioed Zobayan, asking what his intentions were. Zobayan responded that he was climbing to 4,000 feet, but the helicopter was descending rapidly. As the helicopter hurtled toward the ground, a mountain biker watched in horror. He screamed at the pilot to pull up. His cries were drowned out by the screech of the engines. Seconds later, the hillside erupted in a huge fireball. The 911 call came within seconds. At first, the sheriff's office and fire department only knew that a helicopter had crashed, Due to several eyewitnesses, by the time the fire department arrived on the scene, it was too late. There were no survivors. Within 2 hours, TMZ broke the story that Kobe Bryant and the other passengers were dead, sparking the first controversy of the tragedy. But how a tabloid found out about Kobe's death first would be one of many conspiracy theories surrounding Kobe's death. One of the prevailing theories is that someone must have sabotaged the helicopter. Zubayan was an experienced pilot with nearly 9,000 hours of flight time, including 2,000 hours in that particular helicopter. Added to that, Island Express had no reported accidents, so there was nothing on the surface that led investigators to believe there was something nefarious about the flight. But they would only truly know by examining the wreckage. The investigators spent several days collecting all the pieces of the wreckage from the Calabasas hillside, and what they found was surprising. The first thing that was ruled out was the possibility of the helicopter running out of fuel. This was due to the huge fireball and extensive thermal damage across the crash site. Next, the investigators looked at possible damage to the rotors or engines. However, they found nothing that would suggest rotor damage or engine failure. But what if the issue wasn't the helicopter and something happened to the people on board? After recovering the bodies, which resulted in another scandal for the LA County Sheriff's Office, when they took and shared photos of the victims' remains, the police brought them to the coroner's office for a full autopsy. In all 9 of the deceased, the medical examiner ruled that blunt force trauma from the crash caused their deaths. Additionally, the coroner also tested the pilot's remains for any signs of drugs or alcohol, which came back negative. Suspicion then turned to the pilot. According to some theories, Kobe had made enemies in Big Pharma in his legal battle over his nickname Black Mamba. A large pharmaceutical company named High Tech Pharmaceuticals apparently owned the trademark on Black Mamba for a diet supplement pill. Kobe was in litigation over the name of this product. Some speculated that Zubayan was an inside guy hired to take out Kobe so the courts would drop the case. But as far-fetched as that seems, is there even a grain of truth to it? Zubayan was hired by Island Express in 2011. Over the years, the already experienced pilot rose through the ranks and eventually became the head pilot in the company. Thanks to his experience, Zubayan frequently got the highest-paying and celebrity clients, such as Kobe Bryant. It's unknown when exactly Zubayan started flying Kobe around, but it was for at least several years. But the pair's relationship soon went beyond merely professional. Over time, Kobe began exclusively requesting Zubayan to be his pilot whenever he had to travel. As the years went on, Kobe trusted his experience so much that he even allowed him to fly his children around without him present. In the year before the accident, Zubayan flew Kobe on several different occasions. People familiar with their relationship viewed it as a close friendship, and no one ever saw them fighting or arguing. So, if no one sabotaged the helicopter and the pilot was not an inside man for Big Pharma, what really happened that day? As mentioned previously, the weather conditions were poor that day. The visibility in the area was around 3 miles. The area where the helicopter crashed was known for bad visibility. A canyon to the south acted like a funnel, bringing adverse weather from the coast inland. This is confirmed by several cameras in the area, including one about 2 miles away that shows intense cloud cover 1 minute after the accident. The evidence shows that Zubayan, certified for visual flight rules only, navigated according to standard policies and procedures. As he made his way onto Route 101, he intended to stay below the clouds that were hovering around 1,000 feet. As he steered his helicopter toward the tricky spot along Route 101, he encountered near-zero visibility conditions. Relying on his training, Zubayan kept the helicopter on a steady course, wanting to go straight up and far above the clouds. The earlier weather report said clouds were at 2,400 feet, and he wanted to climb to 4,000 feet to be sure he could avoid them. But there was a problem. Because of his inexperience in flying with instruments combined with the sudden restricted visibility, Zubayan experienced a phenomenon known as spatial disorientation, or the leans. This is when your inner ear tricks you into thinking you are going one way, but really you're going the other way. This mistake is common, especially amongst inexperienced instrument pilots. And in the 10 years before this accident, there were nearly 200 similar incidents, with many believing the leans were responsible for them. As he was relying on intuition, Zubayan continued banking hard to the left since he felt the helicopter going right. He had lost spatial orientation because of the visibility, and then made the mistake of going down instead of up. Both of these factors occurred at the same time, which explains why Zubayan banked down and left instead of going straight up. It was this combination of poor weather conditions, a psychological phenomenon, and horrible luck that caused the death of Kobe Bryant and 8 others that day. They've stoned people to death for adultery, thrown men from buildings for their sexuality, and beheaded innocent journalists and aid workers. They've even crucified young Muslim men for eating during the fasting hours of Ramadan. Often called medieval in their actions, they say they're fighting the good fight, one that goes back centuries and will end with victory, the apocalypse, and paradise for many of their soldiers in arms. ISIS has indeed brought the brutality of the past to the present, but where are they now? If recent reports are correct, they might be coming to a town near you at some point soon. We're deadly serious about that. ISIS still has big plans for the West, according to those in the know. But before we get to those worrying reports, we think you need to hear the history of ISIS, their resume of savagery that would make a medieval executioner shudder. But how did this all come about? Where did they come from, and what do they want? Can the West shoulder any blame for the rise of ISIS? Will ISIS ever completely go away? You might have heard of them simply called the Islamic State or IS, and you might have also heard them called the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, and of course the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS. They're also sometimes referred to as Daesh. They're all the same group more or less, although this group has evolved over the years. Today, we'll always call them ISIS to avoid any confusion. The genesis of ISIS is complicated when we consider all the decades of conflict between certain groups in the Middle East, notably in Iraq. We won't go into all the nuts and bolts, but we will say that after the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the country's occupation, with the dictator Saddam Hussein ousted, a power vacuum started to form in Iraq. This created profound instability in the region, and extremist groups emerged looking to take advantage of that instability. This included Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI for short. AQI was headed by a Jordanian jihadi named Abu Musab al-Zakari, who merged his Tawhid and Jihad insurgent group in 2004 with Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda itself had a vision of employing elite fighters that could lead a worldwide jihad project, which of course was very hostile to the US, a country viewed as vastly corrupt by these extremists. Al-Zakari had at first received funding from bin Laden, but initially he wouldn't swear allegiance to Al-Qaeda since his own outfit didn't always see eye to eye with the organization. They later joined forces, which led to the formation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Just so you know, jihad to some scholars can mean many things, including the personal struggle to strive in life. But for al-Zakari and many other militant fundamentalist Muslims, when they talk about jihad, they mean the holy war against the enemies of Islam. This show today is about the people waging that war, not the vast majority of Muslims in the world, who certainly do not condone ISIS's beliefs or violence. In 2004, the US intercepted a letter that was written by al-Zakari and sent to Al-Qaeda. It can tell us something about the mindset of ISIS. You, gracious brothers, are the leaders, guides, and symbolic figures of jihad and battle. We do not see ourselves as fit to challenge you, and we have never striven to achieve glory for ourselves. All that we hope is that we will be the spearhead, the enabling vanguard, and the bridge on which the Islamic nation crosses over to the victory that is promised and to the tomorrow to which we aspire. In a part subheaded The Americans, he called them cowardly. He said the aim of this organization was to kill and capture Americans and to sow panic among those behind them and to trade them for our detained sheikhs and brothers. It is also to be said he certainly did sow some panic when he made sure Americans saw the videos of his wrath in action. In Iraq, al-Zakari engaged in terrorist campaigns aimed at Iraqis and foreigners. In part, he rose to infamy in the West as a result of his name appearing on the video of the brutal beheading of an American radio tower repairman named Nick Berg. It was this video and others like it that terrorized the West, which was the entire point of making them in the first place. Al-Zakari was said to be behind many assassinations as well as lethal bombings in Casablanca in Morocco and also in Istanbul in Turkey. Why did they do such things, you might wonder? ISIS says the end of times is coming, and it believes that it is its duty to establish the Islamic Caliphate, meaning an Islamic government ruled by a caliph, a spiritual leader of the highest regard. It's important to remember that ISIS interprets Islam in its own way, hence it's often ruthless in its enforcement of what it considers Islamic law. These people are extremists, make no mistake, but they say they are on a holy path to paradise. Later in the show, we'll let supporters of ISIS have their say about what they stand stand for, so we can't be accused of putting words in their mouths. While many critics have blamed the West for helping to create ISIS because of the post-Iraq war chaos, the West has also been busy killing ISIS leaders for years since that war. The violence has been somewhat of a vicious cycle. The West kills a major ISIS leader in an airstrike, and ISIS usually strikes back with an act of terrorism. The West at least seems like it's winning this battle, but the news reports of tomorrow might be still ugly enough for us to worry about ISIS. The more people live in bombed-out cities where there's no work, where they lose all hope, the more vulnerable they might be to joining an extremist organization. As the United States Institutes of Peace says, ISIS is a problem of yesterday, today, and tomorrow. We'll show you later how new potential recruits to ISIS are being created every single day. This ISIS issue is far from being done, despite it taking a back seat in your news reports as of late. On June 7, 2006, at precisely 14:15 GMT, two U.S. Air Force F-16C jets dropped 500-pound guided bombs, as well as a laser-guided GBU-12 and GPS-guided GBU-38 on a building that contained al-Zakari. And that was the end of him. But not the end of his brand of extremism, it was just the beginning. A man named Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi became the leader of AQI, and in 2010 he rebranded it as the Islamic State of Iraq, ISI, with the intention of regional expansion. The outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011 made expansion much easier, and ISI began operations in Syria, which is when the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or ISIS, was born. The Americans and coalition forces tried to stop the bloodshed in Iraq during those years of chaos following the power vacuum, stationing about 170,000 troops there at the peak of American intervention in 2007. But when the U.S. pulled out in 2011, all hell broke loose again. ISIS started growing in strength, which is the one reason why so many Americans started to criticize the war in Iraq. Iraq had not been remade. It had been destroyed, they said, creating even more terrorists, not to mention all the U.S. soldiers that were injured, killed, and went home with PTSD. ISIS expanded just as 62% of Americans back home said the war had not been worth fighting, according to Pew Research. Pew said the majority of military veterans felt the same way. This was a vastly different opinion than the one coming from many Americans after 9/11. The public and the veterans said they'd been misled about Iraq's so-called weapons of mass destruction, which were certainly not in Iraq. Many say that it was always obvious that these WMDs never existed, and the Iraq War is a war crime. The global war on terror meant more terror, which happened as the US and its allies started to get criticism for their military involvement in the Middle East. There were no WMDs, and while Saddam Hussein was certainly a tyrant with a history of extreme violence against his own people, now there was an extremist group gaining momentum in the Middle East and about to expand globally. Something monstrous had been created, and it grew even more monstrous. On June 10, 2014, ISIS gained control of Mosul, and in July and August of that year, they took control of Raqqa, Syria. A US-led coalition kicked off a series of airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq on August 7th of that year and expanded airstrikes to Syria soon after. The fight against ISIS was on, and it wasn't pretty. ISIS went after non-combatants as revenge and to sow the fear that it much wanted the West to feel. In August, an American freelance war correspondent named James Foley was beheaded by ISIS, with a highly distressing act, or at least part of it, appearing on YouTube with the title A Message for America. ISIS warned that any more airstrikes would result in the bloodshed of your people. That same month, ISIS executed 700 members of the Al-Shaitat tribe in the Deir al-Zor province of Syria. The Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said that many were beheaded after being captured by ISIS. At the time, Reuters reported that ISIS had driven tens of thousands of Muslims, Christians, and members of the Yazidi religious minority from their homes. More foreigners were beheaded as time went on, including Steven Sotloff, an American-Israeli journalist, and later a British aid worker named David Haynes was beheaded on video. About a week later, on September 20th, still in 2014, ISIS in Afghanistan set 60 homes on fire. It was reported that they killed more than 100 people and beheaded 15 of those victims. 4 days later, a French mountaineering guy named Hervé Gourdel was kidnapped while hiking in Algeria. Later, he appeared in a beheading video titled A Message of Blood for French Government. These acts of extreme violence struck fear into the hearts of people, many of them on the other side of the world watching the videos on gore websites after they were taken down from YouTube. But what happened to foreigners was just one part of the extremism. Life in ISIS territory was a living nightmare for the vast majority of people in Iraq and Syria. In August 2014, a 31-year-old man was stoned to death by ISIS in Iraq after nothing more than being accused of committing adultery. Reuters reported the stoning, which happened on Thursday, was the first known instance of the punishment by Al-Qaeda offshoot Islamic State militants in Iraq. although it had been reported previously in Syria. Indeed, in Syria's Raqqa province, reports said 2 women were stoned to death after being accused of adultery. Such scenes became common over the years. In 2016, reports showed 4 blindfolded men being stoned to death in Iraq for the same offense. As time went on, reports stated that hundreds of people were killed in villages and towns where ISIS arrived. The group publicly executed several members of a Sunni tribe in the Anbar province of western Iraq. Often men took bullets to the head after being told they supported the enemy, but women were not spared. One time, 3 Sunni women in Mosul in Iraq were publicly executed for refusing to treat ISIS fighters. As the months passed, large groups of men were thrown into mass graves. Policemen in Iraq were kidnapped and killed. Soldiers who refused to join ISIS were executed. 2 days after some Iraqi soldiers were executed in Wada town in Diyaya in Iraq, 19 Sunnis were executed in Saadiyya for not pledging allegiance to the group. Students were kidnapped and never seen again. Homosexual men were thrown from buildings. There were reports of crucifixions, including the report we told you about earlier, in which 2 young men in Syria were killed and crucified because they'd broken fast during Ramadan. The boys were strung up with placards around their necks on which the word crime was written. In another news report, it was stated that ISIS was going around checking the length of men's beards. This was after ISIS had told the people of Mosul that shaving one's facial hair was a crime under their version of Sharia law. That same news report stated, 5 crucified bodies were put on display at a road junction on Tuesday, a clear message to the city's remaining 1.5 million residents that the ultra-hardline Islamists are still in charge, despite losing territory to the east of the city. Others were seen hanging from electricity poles and traffic signals around the city, residents said on Wednesday. Libyan militants allied with ISIS also caused death and destruction. In February 2015, they'd released a video that showed the beheading of 21 Egyptian Christians, all of whom had been kidnapped earlier in January. Egypt launched a series of airstrikes in Libya as retaliation. ISIS was extreme even for extremism. Cruelty was their modus operandi. They ruled by fear, and when they were able to cement their power, they destroyed places of worship and ancient historical artifacts. As totalitarians often do, they destroyed the past. They took bulldozers and power drills and explosives to ancient archaeological sites. ISIS was taking a wrecking ball to the cradle of civilization. They enraged Jordanians when they released a video of a captured Jordanian Air Force pilot that they burned to death in a cage. We'll explain later why this was supposed to be a symbolic execution. They attacked a museum in Tunis, killing 22 people, and they bombed 2 mosques in Yemen, killing 137 people. In January 2016, ISIS extremists killed 10 people and injured 15 others when they detonated a bomb in Istanbul's Sultanahmet Square. Many of the casualties were merely tourists visiting the beautiful city. The next year, an ISIS gunman opened fire at a nightclub in that same city, killing at least 39 people. On the 31st of October 2015, ISIS blew up an Airbus A321-231 after it departed from Sharm el-Sheikh International Airport in Egypt on its way to Pulkovo Airport, St. Petersburg in Russia. It's never been certain exactly what happened, but ISIS was blamed for killing the 212 Russians, 4 Ukrainians, and 1 Belarusian passenger on board, as well as the 7 Russian crew. In 2016, ISIS released a video in which a man said, "Listen, Putin, we'll come to Russia and we will kill you at your homes." Not long before that, on October 15, 2015, the United States had begun Operation Inherent Resolve. This involved the US and the British and some other nations to a lesser extent, conducting thousands of airstrikes against ISIS in support of Iraqi and Syrian forces fighting ISIS on the ground. As you'll see later, such strikes are ongoing. ISIS might have been knocked back, but it's nowhere near dead and gone. But what ISIS really wanted was to create global terror, not only regional terror in the Middle East. They wanted to export their extreme brand of religion, which meant finding new recruits, many of whom were residents of Western nations. ISIS's ambition to spread global fear became more of a reality on November 13, 2015, when 11 of its members murdered 130 civilians and injured 100 others in a series of horrific attacks in Paris, France. Men armed with guns, some with bomb vests attached to them, attacked a concert hall, a football stadium, as well as restaurants and bars around Paris. This was what terror looked like: the maiming and killing of innocent people who had no dog in the fight, slaughtered in the name of the Holy War. On Boulevard Voltaire, the attackers hit the 1500-seat Bataclan Hall, where the Californian rock group Eagles of Death Metal had just started their song Kiss the Devil. ISIS said their terrorist cell had committed the slaughter because of French airstrikes on Islamic State targets in Syria and Iraq. President François Hollande called it an act of war. Still, did the 3 men who entered that hall with assault rifles really believe ISIS could win the war? Does ISIS still believe it can win? Foot soldiers can obviously cause great damage, but what is the endpoint of all this carnage? How can a relatively small group of men in the thousands beat world powers? One writer on the topic said that the Islamic State is committed to purifying the world by killing vast numbers of people. But so far, it's the so-called Muslim apostates that have been the ones that have suffered the most. Still, global violence remains a big part of the war. There will likely be more attacks all around the world. In 2016, Omar Mateen, a 29-year-old man, murdered 49 people and wounded 53 in a shooting at a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. He told a negotiator that U.S. military activity in Iraq and Syria was the reason he went through with the attack. This was one of the worst mass shootings on American soil. Make no mistake, as you watch this video, Americans are being recruited at home by ISIS. Some of them in the past fulfilled their missions. Sayfullah Saipov, a 35-year-old resident of Paterson, New Jersey, was convicted of a vehicular attack in Manhattan in 2017, which killed 8 and injured 11 others. At his trial, the evidence showed his phone was full of ISIS propaganda. He had videos of shootings and beheadings on the device, which the court heard served as a kind of instruction manual. There was also information on how to make explosive devices. After his attack on those innocent people, he had the nerve to ask to hang an ISIS flag in his hospital room. He told the FBI he wanted to do his part for the caliphate, his part for ISIS. They don't always complete their missions, though. On March 26, 2019, a 28-year-old naturalized U.S. citizen from Trinidad and Tobago named Rondell Henry was said to have stolen a U-Haul truck to carry out a ramming attack for ISIS at a shopping and entertainment complex near Washington, D.C. He was arrested before he could cause any harm. He later said his inspiration was a ramming attack in Nice, France in 2016 that killed 86 people and injured 434 others. Another report talked about James Bradley, a 21-year-old from the Bronx in New York, and Arwa Mutana, a 30-year-old from Hoover, Alabama, who in 2022 were sentenced to 132 months and 108 months in prison respectively for trying to give material to ISIS. Both planned to fight for ISIS in the Middle East. The report noted, court-authorized searches of Bradley and Mutana's electronic devices identified significant extremist content, including IS propaganda, quotations by Anwar al-Awlaki, a video of an individual in prisoner garb being chained and then buried alive. The U.S. has been mostly unscathed in recent years. Still, terrible things have happened elsewhere, including mass death and destruction caused by bombers in Iraq, the death of 5 women at an Orthodox church in Russia's southern province of Dagestan, a series of church bombings in Indonesia leaving 28 people dead, and many more attacks. In 2018, ISIS attacks killed 149 people in Pakistan in one attack, while over 100 people in various attacks in Afghanistan, with more innocent people being murdered in Iran, Egypt, Tajikistan, Syria, and more countries. In 2019, 22 people died and 102 people were injured in the cathedral bombings in the Philippines. That year, ISIS killed 11 Christians in Nigeria, more people in Pakistan, and more in Afghanistan, but for the most part, the West was spared from such atrocities. This was an improvement on earlier years. In 2017, a vehicle rammed into people walking on Westminster Bridge in London and crashed near the British Parliament. The driver tried to enter the Parliament building, stabbing and killing a police officer on the way before being shot down and killed by British cops. 3 people died and more than 40 people were seriously wounded in the attack. Sometimes these extremists have been arrested before they could go through with their attacks. Still, at times they have succeeded, such as when a bomber attacked a crowd at an Ariana Grande concert in 2017 in Manchester in England, killing at least 22 and injuring 59. Some of those injured were just kids. They wouldn't have even known about politics in the Middle East, Britain's often murky past in the region, or ISIS and religious fundamentalism. It might have seemed back then that ISIS was accomplishing its goal of sowing fear across the world, but by December 2017, ISIS had lost as much as 95% of its territory, including Mosul and Raqqa. At the time, Iraqi Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi announced victory had been settled over the Islamic State in Iraq. In 2018, ISIS was also defeated in Syria. This didn't mean ISIS was done, though. ISIS might not be able to hold on to territory that's being attacked by better-equipped local and coalition forces, but their ideology is still spreading around the world. Lone men with a terminal plan in mind or groups of men out to kill and kidnap people can commit horrific violence. They've done it all over the world, and they did it after ISIS lost all the territory in Iraq and Syria. In April 2019, on Easter Sunday, ISIS bombers killed at least 250 people in attacks on 3 churches and 3 high-end hotels in the Sri Lankan capital of Colombo, as well as the Sri Lankan cities of Negombo and Batticaloa. Around 300 people were killed and 500 were injured. 10 days later, ISIS said in a video, "Our battle today is a war of attrition to harm the enemy, and they should know that jihad will continue until doomsday." ISIS may not have the power it had in the past, but it still has about 10,000 fighters in Syria and Iraq, and there are many other ISIS cells around the world. Often there's just one person ready to commit violence after being recruited online in his bedroom. In 2020, a British ISIS fanatic named Sudesh Aman stabbed and injured 2 people while walking down a street in South London. News reports said that the 20-year-old attacker, who was shot and killed by police, had a troubled childhood and lived in a chaotic and extremely unclean house. Such a man might be ripe for extremism, and there are plenty of men like him, not just in the UK but all over the world. Aman had written in the past that deaths of infidels were an eye for British military activity in the Middle East. The irony is much of the UK public would agree with him about the wrongs of the British foreign policy in the Middle East. In fact, much of the British public marched in the streets against Prime Minister Tony Blair's war in Iraq. A recent government poll showed that 1 in 5 Britons believe Tony Blair should be tried as a war criminal. 19% of Brits said Iraq would have been better off under the tyrant Saddam Hussein, given the instability and violence that erupted after the war. A Gallup poll conducted in the U.S. in 2022 revealed similar opinions, showing that just 16% of Americans in the poll held a favorable view of the Iraq War. With this in mind, teenagers going to see pop stars don't seem like the perfect targets for ISIS, but we must remember that ISIS is in a holy war. The infidels must submit or be killed. Even if no Western forces were in the Middle East, there'd still be this kind of thinking among the extremists. Still, most of the latest attacks have been far from the West, with the majority of deaths from ISIS attacks happening in Afghanistan. In 2021, there were also incredibly vicious attacks in Iraq and Pakistan, although one person was killed in New Zealand when 8 people were stabbed at a supermarket. The attacker was well known to police as an ISIS supporter. 2022 was a relatively quiet year for ISIS. However, there were still massacres in Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and in Benin, which left 4 innocent people dead. There was also an ISIS attack in Mozambique. ISIS in Africa has become a very big problem. In 2023 so far, ISIS has had its sights set on Africa. Over 20 men and women were murdered in the Democratic Republic of the Congo when farmers were attacked in the North Kivu province. News reports said one man was found tied to a fence with his throat slit. The report said the people belonged to a group that is an offshoot of ISIS, but no reason was given for the murders. The police did say the group used machetes for the murders to avoid confrontation with the army. The same extremist group in 2023 walked into a village in the DRC and burned down houses and shops, kidnapping people from the village. News reports said they surprised 17 people in a small bar where they were drinking beer and executed them. There was also a church bombing in the DRC that killed 17 people and grievously injured many more. Around that same time, ISIS claimed responsibility for killing 18 people in Burkina Faso in Africa. This came just after 60 women and children were also abducted in Burkina Faso while out collecting wild fruit. News media said, since 2015, Burkina Faso has been grappling with violence spearheaded by rebel fighters affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIL or ISIS groups that have killed tens of thousands and displaced nearly 2 million people. 2 other ISIS massacres happened in 2023 in Afghanistan and Syria. It's hard to say how many of these ISIS supporters around the world truly believe in the holy war and how many are just lost in life and are easy targets for extremist groups. In Iraq and Syria, citizens have faced high unemployment, displacement, never-ending humanitarian crises, and a lack of basic services. One expert said such conditions leave ordinary civilians vulnerable to recruiting by ISIS and other extremists. Humanitarian crises in Africa might similarly be one reason why ISIS has attracted so many new recruits. This is not always the case for new recruits in the West, though. According to research undertaken by George Washington University, the average new recruit for ISIS in the USA is in his 20s, with the average age being 26. They're 90% male, and believe it or not, according to that research, 73% of recruits and likely radicals are middle class or wealthier. The report said there are likely second or third generation immigrants. 70% of them use Android devices for their ISIS propaganda collection. The report said 62% of such recruits had used Twitter in the last month at the time that the report was compiled in 2022. The same report mentioned a list of Americans who'd been enlisted online and had bought airline tickets with the intention of fighting for ISIS in Syria. These people often speak quite openly on social media sites, despite them being under the watchful eye of police forces. It's not illegal to support ISIS if you don't openly threaten violence against others. There's no law against believing in the holy war. The Atlantic wrote in 2015, in theory, all Muslims are obliged to immigrate to the territory where the Caliph is applying these laws. The same article talked about offensive jihad, which would mean taking the fight to non-Muslims in other countries. It means expanding. One of the ISIS supporters interviewed said that the Caliph must wage jihad as expanding the caliphate is the duty of the Caliph. Caliphate said the man don't recognize borders. An ISIS supporter explained in 2013, "Our goal is to establish an Islamic State that doesn't recognize borders on the prophetic methodology." The article explained that in fighting for the movement, one would be granted martyrdom. The war would eventually be taken from the Middle East to Europe and America and beyond, and in the end, there would be an apocalyptic battle against the disbelievers. Many people have preached this, even if they haven't gotten involved with violence themselves. The most well-known Islamic extremist in the UK is undoubtedly a man named Anjem Choudary. He wants Sharia law in the UK, and he's not afraid to say it out loud. He served time in prison for his views, and he's praised the people behind the September 11th attacks in the US and July 7th, 2005 attacks in London. When he talks about magnificent martyrs, it's not strictly illegal, despite the UK's well-known hate speech laws. It seems that if he's not inciting imminent violence, he's protected under free speech laws. Choudary did get banned from Twitter at one point, calling Elon Musk a hypocrite for the ban. Today, he still preaches what he thinks is the holy path. Just recently, he told his followers to target British troops in Syria, Iraq, and North Africa. He criticized Prince Harry after Harry said in his book he'd helped kill Taliban fighters, which he said was like moving pieces from a chessboard. Choudary rattled a lot of Brits when it was reported that he was receiving unemployment benefits of $39,000 US per year at the time, which he said could be used by all Muslims to fund a Muslim holy war. He called this money a jizya, which in short, in centuries past, was a kind of tax or a fee on non-Muslims living under a Muslim ruler. To give you a modern example of jizya, in a statement in 2014, ISIS leader in Raqqa, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, signed a statement that appeared on websites that said Christians in Syria must pay jizya or face the sword. Christians with good earnings were asked to pay about $664 twice a year, although middle-class Christians were only expected to pay half of that, and poor Christians about $166. Back to Choudary, he's blamed British foreign policy for the attacks that have happened in Britain. He also receives a lot of criticism from the Muslim community, but for him, they're not living true to their faith. Choudary has defended ISIS's brutal punishments such as crucifixion and beheadings because that is righteous law, he says. The whole point, he once said, is to terrorize and horrify the enemy. When ISIS burns people in cages, he said it is symbolic reciprocation for people who've died in their houses from airstrikes. When describing the fight in the Holy War, he explained, "There's something called the divine victory and the worldly victory. The worldly victory is to see the conquest of the land and the implementation of Sharia. The divine victory is to obtain paradise. If someone dies on the battlefield, that is what he wants." Nonetheless, he said when he supports the actions of ISIS abroad, he is law-abiding in the UK. He explained, "If I'm living here among the people, I can't attack them, although there may be some people who will respond to those commands." Unsurprisingly, he's one of the most hated men in Britain and has also been accused of being the single biggest gateway to terrorism in recent British history. Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, who was the leader of ISIS in Syria until he was killed by an airstrike in 2016, either Russian or American, was much more outspoken in his approach to brutality and how it should be meted out. He once said in a video, "Kill the disbeliever whether he's civilian or military. Both of them are considered to be waging war. The civilian by belonging to a state waging war against the Muslims." He once told his followers, if you're not able to find an IED or a bullet, then single out the disbelieving American, Frenchman, or any of their allies. Smash his head with a rock or slaughter him with a knife, or run him over with your car, or throw him down from a high place, or choke him or poison him. Do not lack, do not be contemptible. He added that you might also burn his home, car, or business, or if that's not possible, destroy his crops. He then said, if you're unable to do so, then spit in his face. As we've shown you today, al-Adnani's wishes have come true many times over in the last decade or so, but ISIS attacks have been rarer as of late. Thankfully, we haven't heard much from ISIS for a while, but as we told you, ISIS has not gone anywhere, and there are still many people who want to take the fight to the road. Just before we started making the show, Iraq's chief counter-terror officer, General Abdul Wahab al-Saadi, warned that ISIS was planning a large-scale attack on one of its main enemies, the United Kingdom. Al-Saadi said, "We discovered that the UK is the next target outside Iraq. In the past few weeks, we launched major operations against Daesh or Islamic State and killed a large number of terrorists. It was during these raids that they found information about the planned attack on UK soil. It wasn't known what kind of attack it would be, but the UK was first on the list, followed by France, Belgium, and Germany. After the US, it seems the UK is where ISIS would be most likely to strike in terms of the West. It also seems recruits for ISIS are aplenty in the UK. British people have been known to flee the UK to join ISIS in the Middle East. The BBC recently reported about a woman who did just that and ended up in a camp after ISIS was defeated in Syria. The BBC wrote she'd been posting stories on social media and messaging platforms about conditions in detention camps and appealing for Bitcoin. She has cultivated followers around the world, and she asks people to send her cash for the women held in the camps. The camp in question is Al-Hal camp in northern Syria, close to the Syria-Iraq border. It now contains about 65,000 people of 57 nationalities, most of whom live in absolute squalor. It's reported that ISIS almost has the run of the camp, where it indoctrinates people to this day. In 2019, it was reported that an American woman who'd gone to join ISIS was also in the camp. There was also Australians there, but despite the camp squalor, these Western nations are hesitant to repatriate these women. They will always be a threat, and a threat can turn into a bombing outside a pop concert. The camp itself has been called a breeding ground for extremism, which some say is bad news for the future. ISIS was behind 33 assassinations in the camp in 2020, including the murders of 6 Russian women. In January and February of 2021, there were 20 murders, including 14 Iraqi refugees, with 1 child and 3 women among them. 5 Syrian people were also murdered, including 1 woman and the head of the Syrian council in the camp. One of the guards at the camp remarked, "If we look at the camps, there's still little children who are a few years old and are being raised on the ideology of how to kill." U.S. forces are still in Iraq today, keeping an eye on ISIS. On April 3, 2023, a U.S. drone strike killed the senior Islamic State leader Khalid Aid Ahmad al-Jabouri, who it was reported was planning an attack in Europe. Reports state that the man had developed the leadership structure for ISIS. At the time of the drone hit, the U.S. said ISIS continues to represent a threat to the region and beyond. A military spokesperson said that while ISIS isn't what it used to be, the group remains able to conduct operations within the region with a desire to strike beyond the Middle East. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center in the U.S. said in 2023, "The pressure that you need to maintain on the al-Qaeda and ISIS networks that still want to attack in the United States is absolutely necessary because a networked organization that has sophisticated means of attacking innocent civilians is still something we've got to be concerned about." She said lone actors are always a threat, explaining that U.S. citizens still consume extremist propaganda produced overseas that is now slick and made in the English language. She's also concerned about ISIS making inroads in various parts of the African continent, which we've discussed somewhat already. As you know, ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was killed in 2019. In 2022, the man that replaced him, Abu Ibrahim al-Hashimi al-Qurashi, was said to have blown himself and his family up during a raid by the U.S. Joint Special Operations Command. Just months later, Syrian rebels took out ISIS leader Abu al-Hassan al-Hashimi al-Qurashi. So it seems as new leaders emerge, they often quickly fall. As intelligence agencies and police keep an eye on possible ISIS supporters in their home countries, at the moment at least, Syrian and Iraqi forces with U.S. and other countries' help are managing to keep ISIS at bay in the Middle East. But that doesn't mean there won't be any more attacks. There are obviously many people that believe in this holy fight, which, taken to its most brutal conclusion, means killing innocent people, even if they are critics of Western foreign policy in the Middle East. ISIS will always be at war until the end of times, at least regardless of Western foreign policy. Still, maybe one year's foreign policy is next year's extremism, so the vicious cycle of violence continues. It seems for now at least that ISIS is an injured shark swimming close to the seabed, but there's a good chance it won't remain mostly subdued for long. Gazing through the lone porthole, the crew were met with infinite darkness. But that didn't dampen the excitement of the 5 people on board. As the sub plunged further into the freezing abyss toward the wreckage of the Titanic, the pressure on the hull mounted. Suddenly, a low groan echoed through the vessel. Then the sound of cracking filled the air. Before anyone could react, the sub imploded. It was over in an instant. In today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll look at the shocking revelations of the OceanGate investigation and the loss of the Titan submersible. At a depth of around 3,300 meters, the external pressure on the Titan would have been an astounding 4,900 pounds per square inch. Disaster would have likely started with the collapse of a miniature cavity inside the tightly woven layers of carbon fiber making up the hull of the submarine. This small void, and many more like it, would have been only big enough to be spotted on a microscope. It was a manufacturing defect OceanGate were likely to be aware of, and yet continued to use their non-independently inspected submersible to take people down to crushing depths. Immediate and catastrophic structural collapse followed, microscopic cracks radiating from the initial point of collapse all around the carbon fiber hull. Propagating faster than the speed of sound, the crew inside would still have no clue what was happening. Nearly 5,000 pounds per square inch of water pressure pushed against those cracks, shattering the hull. Nanoseconds later, the titanium cap at the front of the submersible is popped off like a wine cork. The crushing depths work most at the front of the hull, where the titanium cap is now missing. The walls collapse inward, and then down toward the rear of the submersible, where the aft titanium cap remains attached and maintains structural integrity. The incredible pressure of the ocean water compresses the atmosphere of the submarine, traveling along the hull in fractions of a nanosecond. Inside, the compressing atmosphere also works on the body of the crew, forcing them down away from the point of collapse towards the rear titanium cap. 5 adult humans are pushed against each other and the titanium cap with so much force that their bodies begin to burst open. The water is now pushing the hull of the submarine in on itself from the front to the back, collapsing it like an empty soda can being stomped flat. The shattered remnants of the carbon fiber hull force the crew's body up against the aft titanium cap, with water quickly following. The crew's remains are liquefied into a thick whitish paste that lines the rear of the Titan. Nothing solid remains, not even teeth. It's all over in a fraction of a second, but slowing time down lets us appreciate the horrible scale of the Titan disaster. And the Coast Guard now knows who's to blame, and while the previous scenario is only speculation, it is a very good guess as to what went wrong. The Titan submersible and OceanGate, the venture responsible for ferrying tourists to the wreck of the Titanic, was largely the brainchild of libertarian billionaire Stockton Rush. Rush formed OceanGate back in 2009, believing that underwater tourism was an untapped potential. There was just one problem: government regulation, which he deemed understandable but illogical. Critical of the Passenger Vessel Safety Act of 1993, which prevented dives below 150 feet and heavily regulated the construction of passenger submersibles, Rush would say it, quote, needlessly prioritized passenger safety over commercial innovation. Rush would design his own submersible, despite what the regulations said. The Titan would consist of 2 titanium end caps with a wall thickness of 3¼ inch. The forward end cap would have the only viewport, from which tourists could marvel at the wreck of the Titanic. The acrylic window would be 7 inches thick, and during deep dives it was recorded as protruding back into the cabin by nearly an inch. Trouble was already brewing from the design phase, though, as the viewport was only rated to dive up to 650 meters, well short of the 3,800 meters where the Titanic lay. But that wasn't the only critical design flaw. Rush believed that innovation was the key to success. Thus, OceanGate was staffed largely with recent graduates who shared his laissez-faire attitude about government regulations. Rush said he wanted a young, inspirational team who would innovate and dream big, rather than hiring experienced submariners with decades of experience operating and building submersible vehicles. Probably because one of these veterans would have immediately told him to cancel one of the most controversial aspects of the Titan. The Titan would make use of carbon fiber material for its hull, which would revolutionize its manufacturing. Carbon fiber is made from thin filaments of carbon atoms bonded together into a crystalline structure, and has proven to be amazingly strong and durable material. However, context is king, and as every applied sciences student knows, materials behave differently in different environments. Rush would be warned against using carbon fiber in the hull by Dewar Marine's president Liz Taylor. She warned that carbon fiber doesn't do well when exposed to extreme depths or submerged in water for long periods of time. It also doesn't tolerate the specific stresses of having the ocean press in on it from all sides while filled with 1 atmosphere of pressure in its hollow interior. Rush waved the concerns away, even when a letter was drafted by 38 experts imploring him to have his submersible inspected by government inspectors. He ignored it. In 2019, OceanGate responded to the letter by stating, quote, "The vast majority of marine and aviation accidents are the result of operator error, not mechanical failure." Most baffling of all, the Titan was not equipped with an emergency locator beacon, which would make it easy to find should something go wrong. And this is why it took so long to actually locate the wreckage. During an incident in 2022, the surface vessel lost track of the Titan for over 5 hours. during which the crew of the ship shut off the internet to keep anyone from tweeting about it. The submersible wasn't even guaranteed to find the Titanic. Simpsons showrunner Mike Reiss stated that it took 3 hours to actually find the wreckage during one dive, despite having landed within 500 yards of it. OceanGate would claim the Titan was built in collaboration with experts from NASA, Boeing, and the University of Washington. All three of those entities would clarify that they had no direct involvement in the designing of the Titan. Although a scale model of the pressure vessel was built and tested at the University of Washington Applied Physics Laboratory without any involvement by staff, Boeing also denied any involvement, and leaked documents would verify that any cooperation was terminated due to Rush ignoring recommendations and testing requirements from Boeing engineers. The carbon fiber hull, a hugely controversial part of the construction, was also never subjected to any rigorous testing. OceanGate would claim instead that it would rely on a real-time acoustic monitoring system, which was probably a big help for the crew when the Titan ultimately imploded faster than it took for an alarm signal to go off. An operations director raising concerns over the lack of testing and design of various elements would ultimately be fired. In 2018, Rush would descend to 4,000 meters on board the Titan on a solo trip, becoming the second human after James Cameron to descend that deep. In 2019, a crew of 4 would descend to almost 3,400 meters. But during the dive, there would be very loud cracking noises coming from the hull. Carl Stanley, a passenger on board at the time, raised concerns with Rush, stating that he believed that the hull had a serious flaw or a defect and that it was starting to break down. He warned that it could fail catastrophically. Rush would dismiss Stanley's suggestions and tell him to keep his opinions to himself. A new hull would be constructed in 2021, with Rush lying to investors about the delay. During the testing of the new hull design, several scale models imploded. Rush insisted on reusing parts of those imploded models for the real thing, despite a stream of warnings that the components could be compromised and weaken the integrity of the new hull. Lifting rings to aid in the recovery of the Titan were also added, and this was despite further warnings that the submarine's body was not capable of handling the tension and the load stress that it would have to bear when lifted. Communication problems during test dives were frequent, with the sub losing all contact for hours at a time with its tender ship above. Thruster and buoyancy issues also plagued the Titan. And during a 2021 test dive with TV host Josh Gates, the Titan only made it 30 meters before multiple technical failures forced a cancellation of the dive. Gates would decline an invitation to join the Titan on a dive to the wreckage of the Titanic. Stockton Rush's disregard for government regulation and cowboy attitude had set the stage for a disaster. So, what exactly happened? On a previous expedition, the submersible and the skiff it was being towed on were partially submerged for 3 days as it was dragged out to the dive site. On another occasion, just days before the fateful dive, the Titan was stuck in a high sea state, battering the crew around for almost an hour. Despite this, on June 17th, the Titan passengers underwent a day of training in preparation for their dive, unaware of the fate that awaited them. On June 18th at 9:14 a.m., the Titan disengaged from its support platform and began its long dive to the wreck of the Titanic. The Titan did not have hardline communications with its tender vessel, the Polar Prince, and instead relied on a text messaging application. At 165 meters, the Polar Prince sent a K message to the Titan per OceanGate procedures. This meant a comms check. Almost a minute later, the Titan responded with K as well. Other than the text messaging system, the Titan also relayed constant pings to the Polar Prince every 5 to 10 seconds. This system would continue operating even during most communication failures in previous dives. As the Titan continued its dive, everything appeared to be going well, though a communications failure arose around 10 a.m., with the Polar Prince repeatedly texting the Titan with no response. At 10:13, the Titan finally responded, stating they had lost system and chat settings, another failure of the communication software. Here, things become curious, because the Polar Prince receives a message saying this is PH, or Paul Henry, a French Titanic expert. When asked if he could see the Polar Prince on his display, the Titan simply sent a message back again saying, "This is PH." It's possible that this communications failure meant that the Titan was not seeing the Polar Prince's messages correctly, though it's also possible that there may have been some error with the air filtration system, leading to confusion from carbon dioxide buildup. At this moment, both ideas remain purely speculative. At 10:47, the first sign of trouble arose. A message from the Titan read, "Dropped 2 WTS." This was likely a reference to the weights the Titan used to help it sink to the bottom of the sea. Now, at a depth of almost 3,350 meters, it's possible the Titan was releasing weights as part of its slowdown procedures. In a previous expedition on a different submersible, Stockton Rush had smashed his vessel straight into the wreck of the Andrea Doria ocean liner. 6 seconds after receiving this message, the Polar Prince stopped receiving automatic pings that it would normally get every 5 to 10 seconds. It's believed that the Titan had experienced a catastrophic implosion at this time. The crew would not have had time to react or even perceive their own deaths, with the implosion happening in fractions of a second. It is likely, though, that they probably heard the same sounds of fatigue and stress on the hull of the submersible as had been heard on previous dives. This time, though, the fatally flawed carbon fiber hull would not tolerate the pressures and cave in on itself. The story of the Titan mirrors that of the Titanic, one of extreme hubris and foolishness, in this case from Stockton Rush, who believed that he was above the petty concerns of government regulation and even advice of experts. Yet his fate and the murder of 4 of his passengers serves as a reminder that government regulation may be restricting for business, but it exists for a reason. 2 years after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, media from both sides of the political aisle is using a similar language to describe the evacuation. We see words such as botched, betrayal, debacle, a chaotic retreat, bloody shambles that was always destined for disaster, with scathing reports now shedding light on what the New Yorker called an uncomfortable truth. What's more, according to a Gallup poll, 50% of Americans think the war in Afghanistan was a giant mistake. That Afghanistan is no better off or is even worse after the U.S.'s 20-year presence there. 61% of Americans, according to an NPR PBS NewsHour Marist poll, did not approve of the handling of the withdrawal process. The Taliban overrunning everything and owning the whole country won't happen, we heard from the White House prior to the evacuation, which also said the withdrawal would be hasty and would be done responsibly, deliberately, and safely. President Joe Biden later talked to the extraordinary success of this mission, words he had to roll back later while facing a barrage of criticism. In 2023, one U.S. soldier who saw it all looked back and said the entire thing was a catastrophe. Like many other soldiers who risked their lives to get people out of Afghanistan, this man had seen bodies ripped apart in terrorist attacks, the body parts of victims tangled in razor wire. He'd seen his own fallen brothers and sisters in arms literally blown to pieces. He'd witnessed mobs of desperate Afghan citizens trying to escape the country heave and sway in killer crowds, adults suffocating in mad stampedes as they held their screaming infant children in their hands, children soon to become orphans. "I've never seen anything like it," said another U.S. soldier, a hardened veteran of war who, like many people, wondered how the military might of the USA could be chased out of a country by poorly armed, badly led men who looked more like farmers than trained combat fighters. Was it all worth it, many have asked. As one U.S. commentator on the war stated, 2,500 American dead, 20,000 injured, $1 trillion or more expended, and for what? As you'll see later in this video, it was actually more like $2 trillion. The withdrawal from Afghanistan was the embodiment of chaos, where goodwill, bravery, savagery, and downright deadly mistakes snowballed into something unbelievably nightmarish. This is the full story. The early 1990s. It's the early 90s. Afghanistan has just seen anti-communist guerrilla warriors be victorious, the Mujahideen, who with $20 billion in funding from the USA has come out on top. The collective was made up of various groups fighting the Soviets, each with pro-Islamic objectives but still independent of each other. With the Soviets gone, the rebels are fragmented across Afghanistan. One of those rebel groups is the Taliban. The Taliban, a word that means students in the Pashto language, emerges as the greatest power amongst the rebels. They are a Sunni Islamist nationalist group made up of mostly peasant farmers and men who have studied Islam in Afghani and Pakistani religious schools. These men have promised to restore order to Afghanistan after the Soviets exited in what was a 9-month-long withdrawal ending in February 1989. The order the Taliban is talking about is in line with Islamic law, Sharia, a law that today in 2023 is in full swing, a curse for many people living in the country, especially women. The mid-90s. By 1996, the Taliban has exerted its influence all over the country. This year, they claim victory in the province of Herat on the border with Iran. A year later, they take the capital, Kabul. This is a city that has once been a major stop on the so-called hippie trail, where Westerners on their way to India in the 70s would stop off to smoke spliffs and admire the arts and crafts sold on Chicken Street. It's already hard to imagine in 1996 that Kabul used to be such a center of vibrant hedonism. Hedonism is exactly what the Taliban doesn't want in their country. These religious fundamentalists are not very much fun. In 1998, they have control over about 90% of Afghanistan, promising the people law and order, peace and stability. They win the hearts and the minds of much of the population who've seen their lands destroyed by conflict with the foreign occupier. The Taliban sell the people on peace and unity, saying they are at the heart of Afghan identity. Many welcome the Taliban when they see their roads are safer and commerce begins to flourish again. They're happy when they see corruption among officials being prosecuted. The Taliban does try to stamp out lawlessness, admittedly with acts such as amputations for theft and beheadings for serious crimes. In terms of human rights, they're also breaking the law. For others in the country, much of the educated and the affluent, the Taliban's brand of rough justice and views on women's rights, which are almost no rights, is from an age gone by. They are no fans of the Ministry for the Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice, which demands males grow beards while ordering women to cover themselves up with a burqa lest they be publicly whipped. This was a country that in the 1970s was seen as progressive for this part of the world. Women, educated women, walked down the street with their hair flowing down their shoulders, some dressed in high heels and short skirts, chatting with many Western men on their adventures across the world in search of freedom and deeper meaning. As an Afghan woman told Amnesty International recently, "As a girl, I remember my mother wearing miniskirts and taking us to the cinema. My aunt went to university in Kabul." In the mid-90s, the Taliban put an end to all of that. They banned TV, cinema, music, and said women should not study after the age of 8. They're now not allowed to even work or leave the house without a male at their side. The Taliban might have brought back some amount of stability in a terribly unstable nation, but they've brought with it the archaic brutalities of flogging, stoning, and public humiliation. In 1996, they cut off the end of a woman's finger as punishment for wearing nail polish. They later found a secret school run by a woman, who's then thrown down some stairs and tortured, warned that if she doesn't plead loyalty to them, they'll stone her family to death. Women are whipped constantly for breaches of perceived impropriety. It's a human rights disaster. Many people flee. Many become part of a resistance, but to understand this video today, you need to know that they also had support. The Taliban's version of law and order is perhaps good for certain hardliners and certainly good for pro-Taliban elites, but it's not good at all for many modern thinkers in Afghanistan. One day in the future, it'll be the reason why women will risk their lives trying to escape when the Taliban, once a beaten force, comes back to power, and the US tries to get tens of thousands of people out of the country in what will turn out to be a very rushed affair. 1999. The UN Security Council this year adopts Resolution 1267, an al-Qaeda and Taliban sanctions committee, which states that the Taliban are in cahoots or at least hiding the terrorist organization al-Qaeda. The UN imposes sanctions on funding, arms shipments, and travel. September 9, 2001. Ahmad Shah Massoud, an Afghan politician and powerful military commander who fought against the Soviets and later led a Northern Alliance coalition against the Taliban, is killed. He's injured in a bomb attack and later dies in a hospital. The mastermind behind the taking out of this celebrated guerrilla fighter and sometimes friend of the West is none other than Osama bin Laden, the man who's dedicated his life to fighting what he calls Western imperialism and super aggressive foreign policy. He's a terrorist of the highest order, already at this time on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. A poet, a soccer fan, and an ultra-violent religious fundamentalist, bin Laden once studied English at Oxford University, but he's come to detest the West, especially the superpower of the USA. In reaction to the US's military-focused foreign policy, he once said, "All citizens bear responsibility for its government's actions, and civilians are therefore fair targets. Welcome to terror, and what will be a war against it." September 11, 2001. Al-Qaeda terrorists hijack 4 U.S. commercial airliners, crashing them into the World Trade Center in New York City, as well as the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A 4th plane goes down in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Around 3,000 people die. Americans are in shock. The whole world is in disbelief. In a speech to the nation, President George W. Bush says solemnly, "Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts." He ends his speech by promising, "America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world." Soon the world will find out that Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda movement are behind the attack. Of the 19 hijackers, 15 belonged to the nation of Saudi Arabia, 2 from the UAE, and 1 each from Lebanon and Egypt. Nonetheless, the Taliban is accused of hiding bin Laden, and this is how our story turns into the American war in Afghanistan. October 1, 2001. News media reports that the Taliban has admitted that bin Laden is hiding in a secret location inside Afghanistan for his safety and security. Kabul's ambassador to Pakistan, Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif, states he is under the control of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. This is a turn of events since only days before the Taliban said they had no idea where bin Laden was. Mullah Muhammad Omar, the one-eyed spiritual leader of the Taliban and founder of the Taliban, says on TV that the Americans as a country are cowardly, and he infuriates Americans even more by saying not to worry as they don't have the courage to come here. In November, he talked about the destruction of America, saying he hoped the country would fall to the ground. This is an America in mourning, a country looking for revenge or at least some kind of justice. To say Omar poked the bear would be an understatement. Much of the U.S. population, still in grief, was glowing like red-hot pincers taken from a fire and ready to be plunged into the enemy. Many years from now, though, these same people may believe their country's government sought revenge in the wrong places, but right now, people's emotions are still naturally inflamed by what's happening. Bush tells the U.S. public that the U.S. will win the war against terrorism and later orders the Taliban to deliver the United States authorities all the leaders of al-Qaeda who hide in their land. October 6, 2001. The U.S. military, with British support, start bombing Taliban forces on this day, officially launching Operation Enduring Freedom. Australia, Canada, France, and Germany also say they will join in, with all Western allies working with the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance and ethnic Pashtun anti-Taliban forces. Both these groups in Afghanistan have already been causing mayhem for the Taliban. The Westerners will need plenty of support. They know little about this country. At this point in time, the U.S. doesn't even have a decent map of Afghanistan's terrain. Donald Rumsfeld will later say in his memoirs that they were having to use old British Empire maps of Afghanistan. This and the ignorance of various other matters related to this very distant nation will prove to be a hindrance to fighting as time goes on. As critics will later say, the war started as a righteous-sounding war, with Americans still mourning, their minds scarred by moving pictures of people jumping from smoldering tall buildings. At this point, the U.S. is seen by many as a crusader carrying aloft the sword of justice, bringing it down on tyranny and defeating evil. But as time goes on, the war takes many complexities. People will start asking, what are we doing there? What do we want at the end of it? Is it worth all the money and the lives it's costing? Many Americans will want to withdraw, but as you'll see, withdrawal will be complicated. November 2001. The Taliban is roundly beaten by foreign and international forces. On November 14th, the UN Security Council passes Resolution 1378. This demands that a central role for the United Nations be established as a transitional administration in the country, while member states are invited to send peacekeeping forces to promote stability and deliver aid. December 5th, 2001. An interim pro-West government is formed. December 9th, 2001. The Taliban regime falls after its forces hold up their hands in Kandahar, and its leader, Mr. Omar, goes into hiding. Al-Qaeda leaders do the same. April 17, 2002. President Bush announces a plan to build an Afghanistan that is free from this evil, the Taliban, and is a better place in which to live. Congress puts aside $38 billion in humanitarian and reconstruction aid for Afghanistan that will be spent until 2009. In the coming months, the U.S. will begin to work on reconstruction. American big business has secured contracts worth many billions. Afghanistan and Iraq, another enemy in the war on terror following 9/11, together will cost the U.S. $5 trillion. That is a lot of money, a lot of risk, but there is still optimism among many Americans. May 2003. U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld announces that major combat in Afghanistan has ended. President Bush tells the American people it's mission accomplished in Iraq. It's not by a long way. The war on terror is actually still in its first phase. A little thing called ISIS hasn't even popped its ugly head up yet. 2005 and 2006. We see a new constitution in Afghanistan, a new president, and what looks like democracy. But in 2006, we also see the UN coalition falling out over commitments and risks. While insurgencies cause havoc with attacks throughout the country, these attacks will go on for years. 2009. In light of the attacks, the new U.S. President Barack Obama pledges to send 17,000 more U.S. troops to the war zone in Afghanistan to counter what is now a worrying Taliban resurgence. By August this year, between 60 to 68,000 U.S. troops are involved in operations in the country. The British have also sent a few thousand men and put aside $23 billion. Other NATO countries and Afghans are also involved in reconstruction efforts while fighting what still seems to be like a good fight. May 1, 2011. Bin Laden is killed by U.S. forces in Pakistan. Polls now show the majority of Americans don't want their troops in Afghanistan anymore. Men and women are dying, and it's expensive to fight and reconstruct a foreign nation that to some extent doesn't want you there. The Brookings Institute will later say American policy was guided by fantasies. What it thought the Afghan people wanted and what they actually wanted were two different things. Many Americans are critical of the U.S.'s presence in Afghanistan. Later, the LA Times will write, "The only winner in Afghanistan was America's military-industrial complex." That's how many Americans already feel in 2011. But many others worry about what'll happen if the Americans leave. Will Afghanistan become a cauldron of U.S.-hating terrorists, where young men are schooled on how to murder en masse people they call infidels? This is one major reason why some people are reluctant to pull the troops out. They want to see a reconstructed Afghanistan a safer place where democracy flourishes. With the benefit of hindsight, a writer for Politico will say in 2021 what many people felt in 2011. Less money could have been spent, fewer lives could have been lost. But that America couldn't have done much more than muddle along for years in the face of a relentless enemy is the unsatisfying, sometimes frustrating coda to our longest war. This writer, Carter Malkassian, one-time senior advisor to General Joseph Dunford, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was in Afghanistan back in the day, seeing with his own eyes how the local police and the average Afghan soldier were less interested in fighting than the Taliban forces were. He explained, "More Afghans were willing to serve on behalf of the government than the Taliban, but more Afghans were willing to kill and be killed for the Taliban. That edge made the difference on the battlefield." He cited a 2012 Asia Foundation survey which he called the most respected survey of the Afghan people. The survey revealed that of those who sympathized with the Taliban, 77% said it was because the Taliban were Afghans, Muslims, and waging jihad. While many Afghans did not want to live under the strict autocracy of the Taliban, for many others it wasn't hard to convince them that the foreign occupiers were their true enemy. These occupiers, saying they'll rebuild the country, didn't even speak the language and never understood much about Afghan customs and beliefs. But Afghans who allied themselves with the U.S. felt that they'd be in danger if the U.S. left. The U.S. had a duty of care. The war seemed impossible to win and impossible to lose outright, but now it was hard to get out. The U.S. and its allies had dug a really big hole for themselves. A Pew Global Attitude survey said that the majority of people in 16 out of 22 countries wanted the military forces to be withdrawn as soon as possible. 2015. President Obama reduces the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan to 10,000. This is down from 100,000 in 2011. This is good news for many Americans. In an earlier Gallup poll, 48% of Americans said they didn't even know why American soldiers were in Afghanistan in the first place. 2017. As the strength of the Taliban grows, the U.S. drops its most powerful non-nuclear bomb, the 20,000-pound, $170,000 GBU-43B massive ordnance air blast, at a cave complex where the Islamic State operatives are believed to be hiding out. The now President Donald Trump calls it very, very successful, but no casualty numbers are given. This mother of all bombs is so large that it has to be dropped from a cargo plane. The Afghan government is in the loop, according to the New York Times. Notably, Afghanistan's former president, Hamid Karzai, said this is not the war on terror, but the inhuman and most brutal misuse of our country as testing ground for new and dangerous weapons. It is upon us Afghans to stop the USA. You should know that this is a man that used to be a friend of the USA. At the same time, the U.S. military calls the war with the Taliban a stalemate. 2018. The U.S. launches airstrikes against opium labs in the country in an effort to reduce the Taliban's finances. The Trump administration cuts off billions of dollars of assistance to Pakistan after accusing the country of helping to hide Taliban operatives. 2019. Peace talks are on the table if the Taliban promises to ensure no terrorists thrive on their soil. In December, the New York Times writes, U.S. to withdraw about 7,000 troops from Afghanistan. 2020. In March, it's reported that the Taliban has launched a series of attacks against Afghan forces. 76 such attacks occur across 24 provinces. This comes after the U.S. military and the Taliban signed a peace agreement. Now the U.S. is concerned that they might be leaving the Afghan people to be slaughtered. If they leave, will the Taliban go on a rampage? The Taliban says no, but the attacks are hardly confidence-inspiring. Still, later in the year, the Taliban and the Afghan government meet in Qatar to discuss a willingness for peace while talking about a new framework for governing the nation. April 14, 2021. President Joe Biden announces that the U.S. will withdraw all troops by May 1st. Echoing Trump's previous statements about forever wars, Biden says it's time to end America's longest war. He says 3,500 troops in Afghanistan will retreat no matter what. It has to end, he says. NATO troops will also leave. Over the years, 1,144 non-U.S. NATO soldiers have been killed, mostly British at 457, Canadian 159, and French at 90. 66,000 to 69,095 Afghan security forces have lost their lives in the war, as have 52,893 Taliban, a couple thousand ISIS, and 2,400 Al-Qaeda. After spending what's said to be about $2.3 trillion, the U.S. is leaving, with 2,324 U.S. military personnel dead and 3,917 U.S. contractors dead. 46,319 Afghan civilians have also died in the conflict, and around 67,000 people have been killed in Pakistan in relation to the war. Amnesty International says both sides, Taliban and coalition forces, committed war crimes, including torture and massacres. With these numbers in mind, not to mention the hundreds of thousands of displaced people, the trauma of a nation, and the destruction of buildings and farmland, it's a hard pill to swallow for some to leave the Taliban back in power just as they were when all this started. Still, the White House will later say there were no signs that more time, more funds, or more Americans at risk in Afghanistan would have yielded a fundamentally different trajectory. It's game over. David has felled Goliath, not with one stone, but with bloody perseverance, and the fact that they could always say they were the ones being occupied by a foreign invader. It was never going to be easy turning the people against who many perceived as their own kind. But this has left the American allies in Afghanistan, the many critics of the Taliban, the U.S. partners, in a very tenuous position. Biden's words on this day have sent shockwaves throughout Afghanistan. The Taliban doesn't exactly have a good track record where human rights are concerned. This, they think, is going to be the end of us. Many start scrambling to leave. May. The one thing the U.S. doesn't want now is a messy evacuation. The Americans send security alerts and make tens of thousands of direct phone calls to U.S. citizens in Afghanistan and also to U.S. partners. The White House talks about the possibility of a rapid deterioration of the security situation and the collapse of the Afghan government. High-risk scenarios are discussed, but no one expects what will happen. They don't see a house of cards collapse. The projections are not close to the reality that will happen. July. As the Americans gradually pull out, the Taliban seizes control of Afghanistan piece by piece, district by district. This month, the U.S. intelligence community warns that the current Afghanistan government will be no more in 6 to 12 months. They're about to get a big surprise. August 14th. Now that the Taliban are in control of all border crossings in the country, Kabul airport is the only secure way out. There are about 3,000 U.S. troops at the airport, as well as 600 British troops. Their primary mission is to ensure the safe passage of embassy staff, nationals of their countries, and coalition forces out of Afghanistan. Diplomats have been told to destroy all documents in their offices, to even get rid of anything with logos and flags on them just in case the Taliban misuses them later. The destruction effort means that many of the documents and passports of Afghans who applied for visas to get out of the country are now gone. Panic already fills the streets as the Taliban surround Kabul. Worried citizens see the Americans on the move. It feels like the beginning of a storm, like a giant person-consuming tornado heading into the city to swallow everyone up. U.S. media announces the Department of State advises all people waiting for processing to find shelter and wait for further instructions. They should not go to the airport until they are called to do so and should follow the instructions carefully. People are scared out of their wits. Many have worked with the Americans. Women who have jobs or are studying don't want to live under Taliban oppression. Some of them have queued outside the embassy for weeks before this day, but to no avail. August 15th. Chaos is in the air as the Taliban take control of Kabul. U.S. Army CH-47 Chinooks and UH-60 Blackhawks are seen collecting embassy staff. Military vehicles buzz around, more than aware of the Taliban presence. About 5,000 troops, mostly from the U.S., are still in the city. Another 1,000 arrive to protect the airport. It won't be enough. Crowds of people ignore orders and head to the airport running, pushing their way forward. As they arrive, they see heavily armed U.S. soldiers. They see activity, hope. People leaving on planes. Some wave their passports in the air, screaming they too have been promised passage out of the country. More trucks arrive in the city filled with men armed with US-made weapons that they've taken from the Afghan forces. Many of these men on the trucks joined the cause after losing family members in the war. They are more than motivated to fight the US-backed Afghans. Some of them race to the presidential palace. This is what victory feels like. They finally won, they think. The streets of Kabul are filled with people running in all directions. Cars honk amidst the occasional gunfire. Women are seen clawing their faces, crying, muttering. The Taliban are here, Kabul has fallen. The Taliban shoots warning shots in the air, telling them there's no need to leave, that it's safe for them, that they're here not as aggressors but as saviors. For the women, these are lame words. The Taliban uses their trucks and guns to herd the people away from the place they want to go, the airport. They aren't shooting anyone, but they are certainly not afraid to beat them back with sticks and the butts of their rifles. These are newly acquired rifles, trophies of a sort. During the Taliban's successes in taking back control all over Afghanistan, they have unarmed Afghan forces who over the years have made use of the billions of dollars of military hardware supplied by the Americans. The Taliban have seized 650,000 weapons, 350,000 M4s and M16 rifles, 65,000 machine guns, 25,000 grenade launchers, and 2,500 mortars and howitzers. On this day's initial push to the airport, close to 5,000 people have arrived. There's no way in hell they'll all get through today. The Americans put up more barriers, but people try to charge through them and climb over them. They breach the barriers, running onto the runway. The US and British troops try their best to push them back, sometimes having to fight them off. If these people remain on the runway, no one will get out. The soldiers, mostly US Marines and British paratroopers, do everything they can to clear the runways. This is incredibly unnerving for them. Anyone could be in these crowds, desperate civilians or desperate terrorists, with bombs strapped to their bodies. August 16th. Early in the morning, crowds wait outside the airport. People are shouting, crying. Some have had no water for 24 hours. As the day heats up, maybe 8,000 or 10,000 people are now at the airport, each desperately trying to get out. Apache helicopters fly overhead, swooping down low to disperse the crowds who've reached the runway. "Why aren't they taking us?" one woman can be heard asking. "They said they'd take us." Outside the wall, it's like a scene from a zombie movie. US soldiers shout again and again, "Get back! Get back!" They fire warning shots. They have no idea if any of these people are carrying bombs or guns. They have to protect the airport and the people inside it. If those outside have any chance of getting in, they need to be processed first in an orderly manner. Right now, that seems all but impossible. In the evening, there's a mad stampede outside the wall. A woman is crushed as she's still holding onto her child's hand. Shots can be heard. No one knows who fired them. The crowd sways again. A man and 2 children lay dead on the floor when it clears. A massive C-17 military transport aircraft now lands at the airfield. It's soon surrounded by countless people running at the side of it, touching it as if by doing that they'll simply vanish with the plane to a distant land, a safe haven. "Get those people off the damn runway," a US officer can be heard shouting. The troops try their best, but they're overwhelmed. They can't just shoot them. The C-17 picks up speed, but people have climbed onto the side now. This is an act of utter desperation. When the plane takes off, they fall to the ground and crash on the runway. Some of them chose to jump. The crowd down below couldn't see why, but these men had sat where the wheels were, and when the pilot retracted the wheels, the men had 2 choices: be crushed or jumped, so they jumped. One of them was Fida Muhammad, a 24-year-old dentist who had been doing well in Kabul after opening his own dental clinic. He landed on a house roof, waking the owner up, who went outside and saw 2 battered bodies lying on the roof. The US military later reported that they found human remains in the wheels when the plane landed in Qatar, but didn't say how many bodies. It was also discovered that a 17-year-old soccer player, a big Lionel Messi fan, had been crushed on the runway when he got in the way of the wheels. He just called his brother and told him, "Pray for me, I'm going to America," to which the brother responded, "What will you do in America?" Several times, the Americans and British lose and regain the use of the runway. Now there are dead bodies lying around that need to be cleared off. Families stand around the deceased, weeping. "Get them off the runway," an officer screams to his men. Some of these soldiers will need psychological counseling for what they'd just seen. British soldiers will also receive therapy after seeing something that later happens to their American military friends and Afghanistan civilians. For many, the withdrawal will be more traumatic than the war itself. There's only one thing they can do. The Americans ask Afghan special forces to clear the airport and the runway. The Afghan soldiers don't ask politely. They don't even push people around. They mow the civilians down in trucks, shooting some of them. It turns into a small massacre, dead bodies everywhere. A US soldier later says in an interview, but it cleared the runway. No one knows how many Afghan civilians have died already in the crush or on the runway, but the number that people back home hear from the media is almost certainly less than the reality. In a speech, President Biden says he made the right decision despite the chaos. However, he and everyone else did not expect Kabul to fall so quickly. He said, "The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan's political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometimes without trying to fight." He adds, "We gave them every chance to determine their own future. What we could not provide was the will to fight for that future." He says the withdrawal was always expected to be hard and messy, but no one really expected it to be this messy. And soon, hard and messy will feel like unsuitable adjectives. Things are going to get much worse than hard and messy. August 17th. The Taliban orders a press conference in an effort to persuade the thousands of people at the airport to stay in the country. Their spokesman says, "There's nothing to fear. Don't fear the country. The hatred is over. You don't need to escape." He adds, "His Excellency says those who stood against us will all be forgiven. Everyone is forgiven. Those at the airport can go home right now. Nothing will happen to them." A year later, in 2022, Amnesty International writes about life under the Taliban after the withdrawal. Peaceful protesters faced arbitrary arrests, torture, and enforced disappearance. The Taliban conducted extrajudicial executions, arbitrary arrests, torture, and unlawful detention of perceived opponents with impunity, creating an atmosphere of fear. Public executions and floggings were used as punishment for crimes such as murder, theft, illegitimate relationships, or violating social norms. They didn't go around massacring people in the streets after the US left, but they hit any kind of criticism with a sledgehammer. At the press conference, they said women could work. Yet an Afghan female reporter that very day was denied entrance to the conference because she was a woman. The Afghan Minister for Women's Affairs later said she was told outright that if she did not leave the city within 3 days, she would be assassinated. At least now the Americans have the people back outside the barriers. They've fortified 3 gates, the North Gate, the East Gate, and the Abbey Gate. Masses of crowds push against all of them. Many are up to their waists in the filthy water of a sewage canal. Some are collapsing from exhaustion. An order is given. The Marines on the ground cannot believe their ears. They are to work with the Taliban, the same guys they've been trying to kill for 20 years. The agreement is that the Taliban will take care of external security and the Americans can concentrate on the inside of the airport. An agreement had to be made. Both the US and the Taliban have received intel stating ISIS is about to attack. Still, a soldier will later say, "I'll never forget standing shoulder to shoulder with the Taliban. The deep-seated hatred as I looked into his eyes, the instinct that wanted to fight. You could tell that it was in him as well." As soon as they opened one of the gates, a whole flood of people pushes through, women, men, and children squeezed between them. "Back the F off! Back off!" soldiers scream over and over as somewhere nearby, someone fires off a round of ammunition. As the day comes to an end, the heaving crowd outside stretches for miles. The American troops are overwhelmed by the sheer disorder. It's a security nightmare. The fear is palpable and also justified. Violence is brewing. Something terrible is going to happen. Everyone knows it. The situation is out of control, and terrorists thrive in chaos. When a Marine gets some much-needed shut-eye that night, screaming and gunfire fill his ears. The last thing he saw before he went to bed was a kid trying to pull himself off the razor wire. As the Marine drifts off to sleep, a Taliban soldier outside the wall watches a woman collapse. He too never expected such devastation in the end. For once, the Taliban and the Americans can agree, this is madness. August 18th. It's a similar scene as day breaks. But when that American soldier returns to the wall, he notices more desperation in the air. People are dying from exhaustion. With this added desperation, a literal fight for their lives, the crowd pushes harder, ignoring the Americans' constant shouting to get the hell back. To disperse the crowd, the Americans use more CS gas, firing off non-lethal grenades. Afghans are shot by rubber bullets dropping to the ground. The gate cannot be breached. Any one of those people could be planning to blow up the airport. On this day, desperate parents in the crowd pass their baby on top of the crowd as if it were a piece of luggage. If they die, so be it, but they want their baby to survive. It makes its way to the wall, where a Marine grabs it by one arm and passes it behind him. The picture will be published worldwide, but over the last few days, it's just par for the course. The baby will survive and be reunited with its parents. The child, mother, and father will get out of the country. An elderly man has just died in a tear gas cloud. A woman screams, "It's not worth dying for this." She tells her friend to give up. Life under the Taliban is better than suffocation, she says. Those with passports and white sheets of paper in their hands will not give up. The papers they are thrusting in the direction of the Marines are apparently letters from the US Department of State, but of course, these have been copied hundreds of times, so they're certainly no ticket to America. Their names aren't even on them. As the day ends, there's a lull near one of the gates. A man, his shirt covered in blood, his pants caked in his own excrement, stinking and filthy, walks up to an American soldier and says quite calmly, "Please let me through. The Taliban will kill me." Just following orders, the soldier pushes the man back and he lands in the sewage canal. The Marine hates what's happening here, but the risk is too high to let the man get that close. If he does, he might let the wrong man through and boom, death and destruction will follow. He must follow orders, but for him and most other soldiers, it's an incredibly depressing situation. August 19th. A teenage girl at the edge of the crowd is heard saying, "I haven't seen my mom since last night, she's lost." The girl weeps as a concerned woman tells her her mother will be all right. The truth is that scores of kids have been made orphans after their parents died in the crush. Standing in the same shot is a lone boy who has the letters USA written on the back of his hand in black ink. Maybe he thinks this will help his chances of getting out. An Afghan man approaches British soldiers belonging to the parachute regiment. He's angry, he's sad. Why did she die? Why not hospital? Why is this happening to us? He's talking about his wife, who the soldiers just covered up after she collapsed and died from the heat and the crunch of the crowd. "What is going to happen to our children?" the man asks, weeping. "I'm sorry, but we did the best we could, we really did," says a British soldier. Another says, "My heart breaks for you, mate." Still, these soldiers have to keep pushing these people back. Anything could happen. August 20th. There is some order at last, despite tens of thousands of people around the airport now. More people pass through the gates for processing. The Department of State verifies their papers so these people can get through the terminal and fly out of the country. They clamber into the vast interior of a C-17. On takeoff, the entire plane is packed full. People strapped to the side, sitting on the floor. Some have one bag with them, their life's possessions. Others have nothing with which to start their new life in the USA or wherever else they'll be sent. August 21st. U.S. intel says one of the gates is currently being targeted by terrorists. A Marine asks another Marine, "Are they targeting us or are they targeting the crowd?" Threat reports are continually issued all day. The north and east gates are at the end of long roads where it's feared vehicles will be rigged up to IEDs. There's nothing the troops can do to stop a stampede later on this day. 7 Afghans die. One is a 2-year-old girl. Her mother, father, 3 sisters, grandparents, and cousin abandon all hope of getting out of the country and head back to the city. If there's good news, it's that a pregnant woman who'd been fortunate enough to get on a C-17 gives birth in the air. The mother and baby are reported to be doing fine when the plane lands. August 24th. Both the Americans and the Taliban have received reports that ISIS is here and intends to attack imminently. They've heard this before, but the threat level is now higher. A car bomb is likely but not certain. Around 21,000 people have already been evacuated, including diplomats and workers from the US and other Western nations. The planes come and go all the time. Around 5,800 US military stay at the airport, plus close to 1,000 British troops. Afghanistan isn't finished with them yet. August 26th. The bomb threat is now at the highest level. ISIS is here, there's little doubt about it. A decision is made to stop processing people through the east and north gates, which leaves one gate open, the Abbey Gate. The crowd around the airport moves and is now concentrated around Abbey Gate. The UK Armed Forces Minister James Happy tells British news media there will be an imminent lethal attack. All Western nations with citizens in Kabul issue similar warnings. It's not a matter of if, but when. Joe Biden also warns that ISIS will attack, saying that these extremists are not just an enemy of the USA, but a sworn enemy of the Taliban. And then it happens. A huge explosion outside the gate tears through the crowd at 5:50 p.m. local time. The blast blows the head of a woman right off her shoulders. The head lands on the razor wire fence. Looking like something from medieval times. Carnage like I'd never seen before, a Marine will later say. His fellow Marines, a few good of them, are part of the carnage, lying dead, bleeding out, or coming around in a state of shock. 11 men and 2 women from the US military die in this attack. 170 Afghans die. Body parts are strewn everywhere. The dying lay on the floor, groaning. There's gunfire, but from whom? It's hard to tell. Later it'll be said that some Marines panicked and opened fire on the crowd, possibly killing innocent civilians. It's utter chaos. Is ISIS shooting? The Taliban? The Marines? Reports will later emerge that the Marines shot at ISIS men who opened fire, but autopsy reports will show that citizens died from gunshot wounds. It's unclear how it happened, but they were shot from a higher position. The confusion is indicative of the chaos. Parents and children lie dead on the floor. The sewage canal, the thick feces-filled water, is turning red. A mass of bodies are floating in it. A male body suddenly jerks up from the water, spitting out the filth from his lungs. He's been shot, but he's alive. His 3 brothers, who with him had all been hoping to get to the U.S., have been killed by the blast. The U.S. mourns 11 Marines, plus a soldier from the 8th Psychological Operations Group, and a Navy corpsman. Their families will later demand answers. How could this happen, they'll ask. The U.S. hasn't lost a service member in Afghanistan since 2020, and now this. Utter chaos and a lifetime of trauma for witnesses and families. 2 of the civilians dead are British dual nationals, one of them a child. Initial reports will say 28 Taliban deaths, but the Taliban will not give the exact number. 150 people have been injured, including 28 Americans. August 27th. A wider perimeter is now established. The tension is so severe it feels like it'll cause an earthquake. It's now been established that the bomber had worn an explosive vest, walked toward the canal where U.S. forces were checking passports, and blew himself up. According to a survivor, it was as if a giant had whipped the ground from underneath their feet. The British troops, who the press said were offered therapy after the withdrawal, were close by. They saw the Americans die, the grisly aftermath of the explosions, men and women they'd befriended, trusted, needed, not to mention the death of civilians who were in bits and pieces all around. There were rumors of a second explosion at a hotel not far away from the airport, but thankfully there's no bomb. Everyone is panicked, everyone is in shock. When will the next attack happen is all they can think of. Bodies, or what's left of them, are now wrapped up in sheets and laid in lines for families to collect. A young Hazara girl about 8 years old lifts off a sheet and faints. It's her mother. "I feel very scared. I have no one," she says when she comes around. She was also injured in the explosion. She's now missing a hand. As she's being treated, a British soldier walks over to a reporter from the independent newspaper and says, "We'll look after her, don't worry. Do you know I've been in the army for 12 years and what's happening here is the worst I've ever experienced?" A younger British soldier then talks, saying, "I've never seen a dead body before. Joining the army, I expected to see people die, but not this. I didn't expect this." Many of their American friends will say the same thing later, that this withdrawal was an absolutely bloody, horrible catastrophe. An Afghan woman then speaks, acknowledging the chaos around her, but saying, "I don't know what I'll do if I get turned down. I can't live under the Taliban. That would be impossible. I would rather be dead." She then looks at a dead body close by and thinks about what she's just said, adding, "I didn't mean that. I don't want to die. Those poor people and their families. I wonder if people in the world outside realize what is happening here." For US and British soldiers alike, this is carnage. It's unbelievably distressing and stressful. Surely it could have been avoided, they think. Still, they have a job to do. More than ever, they study the crowd. Another bomb attack is expected. They could be next to be covered by a sheet. Just as they're speaking to reporters, someone screams, "Get down! Keep down!" Later in the day, the U.S. Air Force launches an airstrike against a vehicle suspected of carrying 3 ISIS members in Nangarhar province. 2 die. People the Pentagon call high-profile ISIS targets who had been planning another attack at the airport. Lives have possibly been saved. This is positive news, but the threat is still there. August 28th. The stench of rotting flesh is unbearable at the wall. The sewage canal is a soup of feces, urine, blood, and human viscera. At nighttime, dogs come to rip chunks from the rotting corpses. Hordes of them arrive, somehow able to detect a feast of human meat from a long way off. What kind of new horror is this, thinks a Marine, shaking his head in disbelief. August 29th. In November, the New York Times will write that the White House and the Pentagon will become the center of numerous investigations regarding the withdrawal from Afghanistan. One of the main reasons is what happens next. On this day, a Hellfire missile strikes a Toyota sedan in a densely populated neighborhood where families live and children run around. The military at first says that bombs were being loaded into the car, that this car had been at a safe house, and that there had been an explosion nearby. They say they had no choice but to strike. But subsequent investigations and Freedom of Information requests prove this to be false. The military lied. The New York Times will later write, Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, initially called the Kabul drone attack a righteous strike, but almost everything senior defense officials asserted in the hours, days, and weeks after it turned out to be false. The driver of the Toyota, Zimari Ahmadi, was said to be at the center of a terrorist plot. He actually worked for Nutrition and Education International, a California-based aid group, and had been loading water bottles into the car. Suddenly, he was in the sights of 6 Reaper drones. Unaware, of course, what was above him, he was blown almost into non-existence. It was later shown that just as the missile was launched, 3 little kids had just come to greet Ahmadi at the car. One second they ran up to him in their excitement, and the next second their bodies were vaporized. Others were killed nearby. The death toll was 7 children and 3 adults. The adults included one translator who worked for the U.S. military. The others had visas for America, having worked for international organizations. Could this withdrawal get any worse? Midnight contemplation. A U.S. Marine smoking a cigarette outside the barracks at the airport peers at the surrounding mountains that are silhouetted on the horizon. He shakes his head, thinking about the last 2 decades, about the last few days of carnage. He stares at those mountains and thinks about the foreign invaders of the past who'd also regretted occupying Afghanistan. What a country, he says under his breath while blowing out Marlboro smoke. He thinks about the British Empire's unfinest hour, the 1842 retreat from Kabul, when this mighty country, the most powerful nation on earth at the time, was embarrassed by Afghan tribesmen during the First Anglo-Afghan War. Around 16,500 people in the British column trying to retreat were either murdered, captured, or died from exposure. There was just one European military survivor. A British woman who survived the attack wrote in her diary, "The sight was dreadful, the smell of the blood sickening, and the corpses lay so thick it was impossible to look away from them. And it took some care to guide my horse so as to not tread upon their bodies." Britain avenged the slaughter, sending an army of retribution to Afghanistan. They crushed the Afghans, burning villages to the ground, massacring soldiers and families, but not before committing heinous acts on the women. After what was called the greatest military humiliation of the 19th century, the Brits got out of Afghanistan with blood on their hands. There would be a second, 1878 to 1880, and a third Afghan war in 1919 for the Brits. Each time the Brits realized what the Americans later realized, that tribal warriors, even if badly paid and badly armed, are a force to be reckoned with. At some point, they'll create untold havoc for the occupiers. The Soviets learned the same thing. Were we ever going to win here, thinks the Marine, squishing the cigarette butt beneath the sole of his boot. August 30th. The Afghan civilians are gone. The last American civilian to leave will be the acting ambassador Ross Wilson. This is it, think the US and the British soldiers at the end. They're finally going home. Aware that earlier in the day anti-missile defenses had to intercept ISIS rockets, they won't feel safe until they touch down on friendly soil. They've smashed everything in sight. They've ripped bed sheets apart, taken hatchets to shelves. They've wrecked every last table, smashed windows, eviscerated car engines and machinery. Right before the final plane leaves, they blow up artillery, rocket defenses, and mortar systems that they've been using to protect the airport. The rest of the aircraft are rendered unusable, barely even salvageable. In total, the Americans, and to a much lesser extent the British, have left hundreds of billions worth of equipment behind. The Taliban at least will get nothing usable from the airport. The last soldier to go is Major General Chris Donahue, the commanding general of the 82nd Airborne Division. His C-17 departs at 11:59 p.m. local time, August 31st. This is where it ends, the 20 years of pain. This protracted toothache of Afghanistan is now over. The Americans shout to the Taliban victoriously are gone. They rush to the airport taking selfies with bashed-up American trucks and celebratory group photos. Some of them laugh in surprise when they behold the destruction. In a video, a soldier can be heard saying, "They didn't leave a single thing undamaged. What a mess." A Taliban fighter will later say in an interview, "They spent 20 years using their modern equipment to destroy us, kill us, and oppress us. This was the end." President Biden appears on TV telling the people the war in Afghanistan is now over. He talks about the extraordinary success of the mission. For many American observers, this is far from the truth. The only success was that it was over. Despite the carnage, 124,000 people were evacuated in the Kabul airlift, the largest airlift in U.S. history. Most of the refugees have been resettled in the U.S., but around 20,000 went to the U.K. and thousands to Canada, fewer to Australia and New Zealand. That's a success, at least. General Mark Milley will later call the withdrawal a logistical success but a strategic failure. Afghanistan itself, the country after the withdrawal, was not a success. The economy after the Taliban came back to power plummeted. The UN warned that without help, Afghanistan would become home to massive humanitarian crises. Yet, with the Taliban in control, countries were wary about throwing money that way. The US, fearing that Afghanistan under the Taliban might still pose a terrorist threat, froze the country's central bank assets at $9.1 billion, which is still not available. In short, as a nation on the whole, post-war Afghanistan was ducked. It's ducked even with donations, of which about $2 billion is from the US, the biggest of the donors. For the citizenry, it's been difficult under the Taliban, and life has been made worse because so many of the best educated citizens left. 97% of the people now live in poverty. Women's rights and rights of expression are almost non-existent. Extremist rule is ruthless, especially for women. China, the country aiming to have more political and economic global influence than the US, says it's planning to invest billions in infrastructure in Afghanistan. And the Taliban just inked an oil drilling deal with the communists. Still, as Western pundits are asking, will China, like the Soviets, the British, and the US, lose mountains of money trying to buy stability and influence in this tempestuous region? It's a gamble that might backfire. The story of Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 is full of mystery. On March 8, 2014, the Boeing 777 left Kuala Lumpur for Beijing. In the coming hours, there would be odd occurrences, deception, and the disappearance of 227 passengers and 12 crew members. The plane would vanish with only ghost signals and incomplete data for investigators to follow. For almost 3 years, search missions scoured the waters and seafloor of the Indian Ocean without locating the missing plane. Now, new evidence and theories could shed some light on what actually happened to Flight 370 and the 239 souls on board. In order to understand what happened and analyze new evidence, we need to go back to the beginning, back to the very moment that Flight 370 rose into the air and set an erratic course that would lead it to mysteriously vanishing. March 8, 2014, 12:41 a.m., 2 hours before Malaysian Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Flight attendants walk down the carpeted aisle of the Boeing 777-200ER, ensuring that everyone has their seatbelts fastened in preparation for takeoff. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah does his final pre-flight checks and confirms the airliner is ready to go with his first officer, Fariq Abdul Hamid. The flight tower radios the pilots that they're clear for takeoff. Captain Zahari throttles up the engines and the plane lurches forward. The craft picks up speed as it cruises down the runway, pushing passengers back into their seats. It's extremely early in the morning, so most of the passengers are already fast asleep. A baby coos from its mother's lap as several individuals look out the windows at the lights of the airport flashing by. Flight 370 lifts off from the runway and ascends into the air. Condensation runs along the window as people close their shades and prepare for the approximately 6-hour flight to Beijing. What no one knows is that as night gives way to dawn, every single person aboard Flight 370 will go missing. 1:01 a.m., 1 hour and 40 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. The aircraft reaches a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet or 10,700 meters. The fasten seatbelt sign is turned off and the flight crew begins preparing snacks, drinks, and meals for the passengers. It's an overnight flight, so cabin duty should be relatively light. Some passengers stand up and stretch on the way to the bathroom. The faces of businessmen from Beijing are illuminated by their laptop screens. The snoring of sleeping passengers can be heard, complementing the roar of the plane's engines. On the ground, radar stations pick up Flight 370's signal. Everything is normal. In a little while, Flight 370 will leave Malaysian airspace and cross into Vietnam. The early hours of this morning seem like any other day. 1:07 a.m., 1 hour and 33 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. The Malaysian flight tower receives data from Flight 370's aircraft communication addressing and reporting system. This communications array periodically transmits data about the plane and the status of several key systems on board. This will be the last time ACARS communicates with traffic control. The tower won't notice it for 30 more minutes, but someone has turned off the ACAR system. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had a premeditated plan to fly the aircraft off course on some unknown route for some unknown reason. With Flight 370's aircraft communication addressing and reporting system turned off, the radar stations in the area no longer receive telemetry from the plane. No one on the ground knows the system has been turned off at this point in time, as there's no reason to expect anything to be wrong. However, something strange is happening aboard Flight 370, whether ground crews are aware of it or not. It's not clear if either the pilots are aware that the ACAR system has been turned off, or if one of them is the perpetrator, but this will be the first of many peculiar events that will happen over the next several hours. 1:19 a.m., 1 hour and 20 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Malaysian traffic controllers receive a message from the cockpit of Flight 370. It's believed to be First Officer Fariq Abdul Hamid on the headset. He does not sound agitated, and he gives no indication that there is anything wrong, even though the ACARS aboard the plane is off. This does not mean that Fariq is the one who tampered with the system or that he's even aware that something is wrong, but a series of bizarre events begin after the message is sent. The voice finishes relaying a quick message and ends with "Alright, good night," indicating that he's signing off just before entering Vietnamese airspace. Traffic control thinks nothing of the message, as good night is often used by pilots to signal the handing over of communications from one airspace to another. The phrase is just a pleasantry that traffic controllers hear hundreds of times a week as planes leave their airspace. However, this time, good night are the last words anyone will ever hear from the crew and passengers aboard Flight 370, 1:21 a.m. Just as Flight 370 crosses into Vietnamese airspace over the South China Sea, someone in the cockpit flips a switch. The plane's transponder switches off. This is much more noticeable than when the aircraft communication addressing and reporting system was shut down, as the transponder constantly pings radar stations with the flight number, altitude, speed, and heading of the plane. The transponder is also a lot less complicated than turning off the ACAR system. Without the transponder on, the massive 777 is an unknown blip on the radar. Traffic controllers scan their radar screens and see dozens of little dots, however, one catches their eye. It has no flight number and isn't sending any relevant data. They keep a close eye on the aircraft to try to figure out what it is and why it isn't relaying any information. No one is overly concerned at this point. They just know something odd is happening. A soldier conducting radar surveillance at a military base in Thailand spots the blip on his screen. There's an unidentified aircraft approaching the base. There are no covert missions scheduled for that night, so this is a cause for concern. He informs his CO, and they keep tabs on the unidentified aircraft. Sometime between 1:21 a.m. and 1:28 a.m. No one knows at this moment in time that the unknown aircraft showing up on the radar across Thailand, Vietnam, and Malaysia is Flight 370. Its transponder is still off. However, the unknown object suddenly begins to change course. A Thai radar station in the southern Surat Thani province records that the plane makes a U-turn and is now flying in the opposite direction than it had been traveling in moments before. At this point, there is no reason for anyone to suspect that Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 is the unknown craft on their screens, or that any action should be taken. This uncertainty will result in precious time being lost during the early stages of the search for the missing airliner. 1:30 a.m. Suddenly, the blip from the unknown aircraft disappears from the air traffic controller's radar in Subang, outside of Kuala Lumpur. It has vanished somewhere over the Gulf of Thailand. The last known coordinates of the plane are 065515 north and 1033443 east. It's not clear what has happened exactly, but it appears the SATCOM system has been tampered with. 1:37 a.m. Malaysian military and civilian flight radars start picking up the unknown aircraft again. Its course has been altered, and the plane is now flying southwest over the Malay Peninsula before turning northwest over the Strait of Malacca. Traffic control in Malaysia realizes that the ACAR's reading from Flight 370 has not been sent and is overdue. It was supposed to be transmitted 30 minutes after the previous communication was sent at 1:07 a.m. Since this is an automated system, the traffic controllers know something is wrong. It's at this point they realize the unknown plane they've been tracking could very well be Flight 370, but there is no way to confirm this suspicion without reaching out to multiple other agencies and trying to contact the plane. In hindsight, investigators divulged that if the plane were to be hijacked or a target for terrorist activity, turning off the ACARs would be an important part of their plans. Without ACARs data being transmitted, no anomalies in the aircraft systems could be detected from the ground. The transponder being switched off is much more noticeable, but the ACARs data would have provided traffic control or anyone tracking the plane with a lot more information on what was actually happening to the aircraft at the time. 2:15 a.m., 25 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Even though several civilian Malaysian radar stations are no longer tracking the unknown plane, military radar stations still have the aircraft on their screens. As it flies over the Strait of Malacca, the plane passes over the island of Pulau Perak. It continues on a westerly direction, hundreds of miles off course. As the plane continues into the Indian Ocean, fewer and fewer radar stations can track it, until only a handful still have the unknown blip on their screens. 2:22 a.m., 18 minutes before Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. A Malaysian military radar station that's been following the aircraft's movements as it continued west loses contact over the Andaman Sea. This will be the last time anyone sees the aircraft on their radar. However, it will still be 18 more minutes before Malaysia Airlines acknowledges that Flight 370 is missing. It's not clear what the airline does during the realization that Flight 370's ACARs failed to send data, the loss of telemetry with the aircraft, and the eventual disappearance of it from radar. But it is likely that traffic controllers and their superiors had been going into damage control mode to try to keep things quiet until they had a better handle on the situation. March 8, 2014, 2:40 a.m. Air traffic controllers officially tell Malaysia Airlines that Flight 370 has disappeared. The airline scrambles all of its resources to try to locate the plane. They reach out to agencies and organizations across the region and contact the Malaysian military for help finding their missing plane. The Malaysian military hands over all raw radar data they have to US and British officials to help aid in the search and recovery of the lost plane. The race to figure out where the Boeing 777 has gone is on. Ships and aircraft are sent to the last known location of Flight 370 in the Andaman Sea. For the next hour, the preliminary search for Flight 370 begins. Military analysts and traffic controllers send messages on every possible communications channel to try to reach the missing aircraft. Malaysia Airlines calls upon traffic controllers in Vietnam, Thailand, and other parts of Malaysia to try to make sense of the situation. Information is gathered that paints an unusual picture of events. Nothing makes sense, and no one can figure out what has happened to the missing aircraft. The rest of the world has yet to be informed that Flight 370 and its 239 passengers and crew will not be landing on time. After just over an hour has passed, and it's clear the plane won't be located using conventional means, Malaysia Airlines takes things to the next level. 3:45 a.m. 1 hour and 5 minutes after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. A code red is issued by Malaysia Airlines to every agency that might be able to help locate the missing plane. Emergency response plans are enacted and search missions are launched. When the airline is pushed to explain why they waited over an hour to issue such an order, they tell the authorities that they were still trying to locate the plane and ensure it was actually missing. It's unclear if Malaysia Airlines had ulterior motives or if it was just incompetence that led to the slow sharing of information with other organizations. But either way, an emergency is eventually declared. For the next several hours, search and rescue missions are launched. Multiple organizations sift through the data to extrapolate where the plane might have gone. Salvage teams prepare for the worst. 6:30 a.m. 3 hours and 50 minutes after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Passengers in Beijing wait for their plane to reach the gate. Flight 370 is displayed on the arrival sign, but the plane has yet to arrive. Disgruntled travelers wait for an announcement as to where their plane is and what's causing the delay. So far, Malaysia Airlines has not updated anyone about the loss of the aircraft, except for agencies and organizations that are directly involved in locating the plane. 7:24 a.m. There's still no sign of Flight 370 or any indication of what went wrong. Families are worried about their loved ones who should have landed and checked in an hour ago. The airline has received inquiries but remains silent until now. A public announcement is posted on the Malaysia Airlines Facebook page. When this happens, there is mass panic and confusion amongst friends and family members who had people on board the flight. The international community becomes aware of the search for the missing plane. Everyone waits with bated breath to learn more about the tragedy and mysterious circumstances under which Flight 370 disappeared. 8:11 a.m., 5 hours and 31 minutes after Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 goes missing. Something very strange happens. A satellite orbiting the Earth attempts a handshake or electronic connection with a plane passing below it. The satellite logs the attempted connection to the plane and relays the information to a computer database. The handshake isn't completed due to the fact that the communication systems aboard Flight 370 are offline. However, once this data comes to light, it provides a vital clue to the search and rescue parties trying to locate the aircraft. The aircraft is still in flight. Based on where the satellite is located and a number of other factors, the location of Flight 370 can be narrowed down to 2 different locations. However, since the plane is clearly still operational, the final destination of where the aircraft will touch down will need to be extrapolated. The raw satellite data is enough to confirm the plane the satellite attempted to connect with was Flight 370, which is then corroborated by the United States National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Aviation Administration, and Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch. With the little information that was available at the beginning of the emergency, the initial search for Flight 370 had begun in the South China Sea. As more information comes to light, such as where the transponder had been switched off, and the resulting discovery that the unidentified plane that radar stations had been tracking all morning was in fact Flight 370, the search teams are sent off to the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea. However, it isn't until satellite data from the attempted handshake is discovered that search efforts are deployed to more promising areas. March 15, 2014, 7 days after Flight 370 goes missing. The data collected by the satellite on the morning of the disappearance has finally been analyzed. All relevant organizations are notified, and the search for Flight 370 shifts to new locations. No one can be exactly sure of the location of the plane when the satellite attempted its handshake, but analysts now believe that Flight 370 could have only been on 2 possible trajectories. A series of search missions are launched into the Indian Ocean to the southwest of Australia, following the southern route the plane might have taken. Another group searches Southeast Asia, Western China, and Central Asia following the northern arc. Locating a downed plane on land can be difficult, but it's much easier than locating an aircraft on the bottom of the ocean. After days of searching, no trace of any downed aircraft can be found along the northern arc. March 24, 2014, 16 days after Flight 370 goes missing. After further analysis of the satellite data by the satellite's parent company, Inmarsat, and the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch, it's determined that the southern arc is the most likely path that Flight 370 took, and the plane must have crashed in a remote part of the Indian Ocean. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak announces it's highly unlikely that anyone who was aboard the plane could still be alive. The hopes of hundreds of families and friends are shattered. However, the crusade to figure out what happened and to provide answers is not over yet. April 6, 2014, 30 days after Flight 370 went missing. An Australian ship cruises through the waters of the Indian Ocean. They've been searching for any signs of Flight 370 for 2 weeks. Suddenly, the equipment on the vessel detects several acoustic pings that could possibly be from the black box or flight recorder aboard the missing Boeing 777. These signals are coming from below the waters, around 1,200 miles or 2,000 kilometers northwest of Perth, Australia. It's impossible to tell exactly where the signals are coming from, but it allows the search teams to narrow down the locations they're looking at. Around this time, new data from Inmarsat comes out that a satellite initiated another handshake with Flight 370 around 8:19 a.m. on March 8th. The second handshake is consistent with the location where the acoustic pings are being picked up by the Australian vessel. Unfortunately, by this point, the batteries within the black box are likely on their last legs. It'll only be a matter of time before the batteries go dead and the signal is lost. Even after the signal is gone, robotic submarines are deployed to the region to scour the ocean floor for any signs of wreckage. Unfortunately, the pings had been identified over a large area, and there's no way to pinpoint the exact location. The subs continue to search underwater, even though the search area is vast. The search yields no results. The disappointment is exacerbated by the fact that tests run after the fact find that a faulty wire in the acoustic equipment aboard the ship might have been what was producing the pings. July 29, 2015, 1 year and 5 months after Flight 370 goes missing. A man walks along the beach of the French island of Réunion. He spots debris washed up on the shore. This is not unusual, as the currents running through the Indian Ocean often bring garbage adrift in the ocean to the island. However, this is different. It looks like a piece of an airplane. The man calls to others in the area and they bring the salvaged debris to the local authorities. It's identified as the right-wing flaperon of a Boeing 777. Upon further inspection by experts, it's identified as being a piece of Flight 370. The debris washed up 2,300 miles, or about 3,700 kilometers, from where the search for the missing aircraft is being conducted in the Indian Ocean. Over the next year, 26 more pieces of debris are discovered on beaches in Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, and Mauritius. The finders all claim that they're part of Flight 370, however, only 3 can be positively identified as belonging to the missing aircraft. While 17 are thought to be from Flight 370, 2 pieces seem to have come from the cabin interior, suggesting the aircraft broke apart either before or when the plane crashed into the ocean. When experts further examine the flap found in Réunion, they determine it does not appear the plane was guided into the ocean using a controlled descent. Therefore, the only other option is that Flight 370 slammed into the dark waters of the ocean and sunk to the bottom. The information gathered from confirmed debris of the aircraft allows the search area to be narrowed down even further, as some parts of the Indian Ocean do not have the currents to carry wreckage all the way to Africa. January 2017, 2 years and 10 months after Flight 370 goes missing. The Malaysian, Australian, and Chinese governments announced they will be calling off the search for Flight 370. After almost 3 years of hunting, they have come up with no tangible evidence as to where the aircraft could be. The Indian Ocean is vast. The seafloor can reach depths exceeding 5,000 meters, or 16,404 feet. An American company called Ocean Infinity receives the go-ahead from the Malaysian government to continue the search, but in May 2017, the Malaysian Transport Ministry officially decides it's time to end all search efforts. July 2018, 3 years and 4 months after Flight 370 goes missing. The Malaysian government releases its final report on Flight 370 and its disappearance. Investigations find that what happened likely wasn't the result of mechanical failure, as both the ACARS and transponder systems would not have gone down. Then there's the fact that the erratic flight path almost certainly needed to be carried out through manual inputs by a pilot. However, no clear reason is given as to why Flight 370 disappeared or where the aircraft is located. Throughout the official investigation, ideas as to what actually happened to Flight 370 spread across the globe. Conspiracy theories pop up on the internet. Entire books are written about the disappearance of the Malaysia Airlines plane. Experts weigh in on what the data said and if it was reliable. What most official reports conclude is that there just isn't enough evidence to come to a definitive conclusion on what happened to Flight 370. However, a lot has happened since the plane disappeared, and there are several theories that have made it to 2023 that could shed some light on this mystery. There are still a lot of missing facts, but sometimes it's the lack of facts that can be one of the strongest pieces of evidence in a case. Let's go down the rabbit hole and examine some of the leading theories of 2023 as to what actually happened to Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. There's one thing that time has helped with in the case of Flight 370. When news first emerged about the mysterious circumstances under which the aircraft disappeared, there were conspiracies galore. The internet was flooded with theories of alien abduction, sabotage, and military intervention. There was even some discussion and doctored footage of Flight 370 ending up in the Bermuda Triangle. And even though these theories might seem harmless, the last one included a video and a website that allowed hackers to steal people's money and identities. So this particular conspiracy ended up being very harmful. However, now that it is 2023, some of the more outlandish theories have died away. People who are still serious about finding the aircraft and bringing closure to the families and friends of those on board are still hard at work. This has allowed much more convincing and somewhat plausible explanations to emerge. One of the leading theories, and possibly the most plausible with all the information we currently have, is that one of the pilots took control of the plane, disabled all communications, and somehow was able to maintain control without the passengers, flight crew, or his co-pilot getting involved. Let's take a look at why many believe this was the case and what needed to be done for this individual to be successful. For this theory, most think Captain Zahari somehow locked his first officer out of the cockpit and turned off the systems that would allow traffic control to identify the plane. He then put on an oxygen mask and depressurized the aircraft at a height of 35,000 feet, resulting in the asphyxiation of everyone else in the plane. In this scenario, whoever was in control of the plane changed its course to fly along the borders of Malaysia and Thailand to stay clear of any military bases that an unidentified aircraft might have triggered a response from. After making it to the ocean, the pilot changed course again to a southwesterly direction and flew into the ocean, where the aircraft would never be found. But why would Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah or First Officer Farik Abdul Hamid do this? Some believe it was to take their own life in a way that would also claim the lives of hundreds of others. Using Occam's razor, which at a basic level states, the simplest answer with the least amount of variables is normally the correct one, would suggest that either Zahari or Farik took control of the plane and flew it into the Indian Ocean as being the most likely scenario. This is because it fits the evidence and data without bringing in outside variables. However, when examining the profiles of both men, the theory runs into problems. The official reports state that Captain Zahari had no known history of apathy, anxiety, or irritability. There were no significant changes in his lifestyle, interpersonal conflict, or family stress. So, what would his motivation have been? Investigators also concluded that First Officer Farik's ability and professional approach to work was reported to be good. However, mental health and depression can be complicated. Someone might not always show obvious signs that something is wrong, and a pilot taking his own life by crashing a plane is not unheard of. On March 24, 2015, the co-pilot of Germanwings Flight 9525 from Barcelona to Dusseldorf intentionally crashed his Airbus A320-211 when he was in control of it, killing the 150 people who were on board. In this case, however, the pilot had been showing signs of mental distress and had been declared unfit to work by a doctor. Both pilots of Flight 370 were given clean bills of health, and there were no warning signs to suggest they were mentally unstable. There is some evidence to suggest that Captain Zahari had practiced flying a plane into the Indian Ocean on his home flight simulator, but this is tentative at best and could very likely just have been a coincidence. What almost is certainly true, though, is that there was a person in control of Flight 370 who shut off its communication systems and manually changed the plane's course throughout the morning of March 8, 2014. Other than one of the pilots taking control, then crashing the plane, there are several hijacking theories that could shed some light on the odd events leading up to the disappearance of Flight 370. One possibility for this scenario is that either one or both of the pilots decided to hijack the plane and hold it for ransom. However, when they tried to land the craft, something went wrong. You can already see all the holes in this theory, such as no one radioed flight control or contacted Malaysia Airlines to ask for a ransom. Also, investigators determined neither of the pilots were under any financial stress or showed any changes in their behavior. And when they went over the voice recordings and conversations of the men, it was determined both pilots showed no evidence of anxiety or stress. One conclusion that came out of the investigators' report was that it's not possible to deactivate automatic deployment of the masks from the cockpit. What this means is that if the plane was hijacked, the people on board would have had ample time to try to take back the aircraft. Yet there is no indication that any type of struggle happened as far as the data is concerned. This might suggest a different type of hijacking, perhaps someone other than the pilots took control of the plane and were responsible for the disappearance of Flight 370. There were 227 passengers and 10 cabin crew aboard Flight 370. Could one of them somehow manage to take control of the plane? This seems highly unlikely, as any individual or group of bad actors would have had to somehow bypass all of the precautions and safety features implemented on major aircraft after 9/11, such as the internal locking of a cockpit door. Then there's the fact that there would have to have been hundreds of other passengers they would have to somehow subdue. Some of the people point the finger at the 2 Iranian men traveling on Flight 370 with stolen Italian and Australian passports as being the culprits. But upon further investigation, it was determined that these men were illegal migrants and not terrorists. Then there's the cabin crew, but again, this all seems improbable as all of them were married with families and wouldn't have had the technical expertise to turn off all the communication systems and then pilot the plane. This leads us to a more fantastical theory around hijacking, but one that could explain the erratic flight path of Flight 370. Some suggest that perhaps there was a stowaway or multiple stowaways aboard the aircraft. Supposedly, there was an underfloor area just outside the cockpit door that someone could hide in. This would mean the perpetrator needed to sneak aboard the plane before the crew got there and hide until the plane was in the air. Interestingly, from this location, it would have been possible to turn off the transponder, which we know happened. Perhaps a disgruntled employee held a long-lasting, deadly grudge against Malaysia Airlines and wanted to hold the plane for ransom or just cause some chaos. But the same inconsistencies as one of the pilots hijacking the plane for ransom arises with this scenario as well. But what if more than one stowaway or a heavily armed individual somehow managed to sneak aboard the plane? What if there was a larger and more sinister plan in place? Flight 370 being seized by terrorists is normally discredited as no organization came forward and claimed responsibility. But what if the hijacking of Flight 370 wasn't an act of terror, but one of misdirection? At the same time Flight 370 disappeared, Russia was busy annexing Crimea. Many major powers were threatening sanctions and actions against Russia during this time, and the world seemed to be rallying against Putin's decision to steal Crimea from Ukraine. However, when the news broke about the mysterious disappearance of Flight 370, the public outrage around Russia annexing Crimea died down a little bit. News cycles were now covering the search for the missing plane 24/7, and aviation experts instead of military experts were the ones being interviewed. Some have hypothesized that a covert mission either by Russian agents or hired mercenaries was carried out to seize Flight 370 and create a narrative that would distract the rest of the world from what was happening in Crimea at the time. Some have even suggested that the SATCOM aboard the plane was tampered with, and instead of the plane flying into the Indian Ocean, it was piloted along the northwestern arc and landed somewhere in Kazakhstan. Proponents of this theory claim that the plane in fact had never been found in the Indian Ocean because it's not actually there. But let's be very clear, the oceans are massive. Over 80% of the ocean has never been mapped, explored, or even seen by humans. If we strip away all the more extreme theories and stick with what we know in 2023, the most likely scenario is that one of the pilots of Flight 370 took control of the plane and flew it into the Indian Ocean, where the aircraft broke up and sank to the depths of the sea. Finding the fuselage of the plane would be like trying to find a needle in a haystack. Until we have more evidence or something more tangible to go off, what actually happened aboard Flight 370 will remain a mystery. Many believe the search to locate the remains of the aircraft should continue, to offer some closure to those who lost someone in the tragedy. However, as of right now, no one is seriously looking for the missing Boeing 777, except dedicated researchers who have devoted their lives to figuring out the truth about Flight 370. My arms were badly burned, and there seemed to be something dripping from my fingertips. I saw a schoolgirl with her eye hanging out of its socket. People looked like ghosts, bleeding and trying to walk before collapsing. I looked down and saw a man clutching a hole in his stomach, trying to stop his organs from spilling out. The smell of burning flesh was overpowering. That's an answer to the question of what happened after the Manhattan Project. It's a description of what one survivor of the atomic bomb said happened right after the bomb hit his hometown of Hiroshima in the morning of August 6, 1945. We are sure you know now what this project was all about: creating a nuclear bomb. 3 days after the Hiroshima blast and the city of Nagasaki was hit, in all, reports tell us that these two warheads named Little Boy and Fat Man killed in total 295,325 in Hiroshima and 165,409 in Nagasaki. The devastation was unparalleled. The world had never seen such destruction, and the scientists working on the Manhattan Project had done their job well. The Allied politicians and military men rejoiced. The upstart Japan was shocked to its core. sent down to its knees. It was a disturbing coup de grace at the end of the Second World War, a death blow, and a warning of things that might come. That warning remained in people's minds for years. We're still aware of what power governments possess to wipe out masses of populations with the push of a button. But thankfully, we no longer sit on our sofas, chilled to the bone as some TV program tells us what to do when the strike comes. Thankfully, the powers that be know very well that any kind of nuclear attack is a zero-sum game, tit for tat. Everyone loses. We might now ask the question, what were those guys thinking when they decided to work on a project that could possibly end with large parts of humanity being blitzed from existence? That's what we're going to answer today. It actually all started in Germany, because it was there that three very clever men called Otto Hahn, Lise Meitner, and Fritz Strassmann discovered nuclear fission. What does that mean? Well, it's basically, we'll let a scientist explain. Nuclear fission is a reaction wherein a heavy nucleus is bombarded by neutrons and thus becomes unstable, which causes it to decompose into two nuclei with equivalent size and magnitude, with a great detachment of energy and the emission of 2 or 3 neutrons. There's a crude term for this, and that is splitting the atom. All that energy released can be a dangerous thing, as described by the Japanese man who witnessed carnage all around him on that dark day in '45. Anyway, after this discovery, the word on the lab concourse was that it could possibly be used to make a bomb, a very powerful bomb. The Germans were on it, and word got out to the Allied powers that some scientists over there were working on creating extremely powerful bombs of a new type. But to cut a long story short, scientists all over the place were aware of the potential of creating a big bomb using nuclear fission. President Franklin D. Roosevelt got a team together, and it was agreed that uranium was needed because it could provide a possible source of bombs with a destructiveness vastly greater than anything now known. They knew this because an Italian man called Enrico Fermi had been working on nuclear chain reactions. He's sometimes called the architect of the nuclear age. It was discovered that uranium isotopes called U-235 and U-238 could be used for the fission needed to create the explosion. But the former was better. Over in Britain, they had their own project to create an atomic bomb, and that was led by an Austrian scientist called Otto Fritsch and a German-born British man called Rudolf Peierls. We don't want to bombard you with lots of names, but you should know the making of the atomic bomb was a massive collaboration and not some eureka moment for some lone wolf messing about with isotopes in a dimly lit lab. Over in the UK, they thought they discovered a way to actually create such a bomb small enough to be carried by a bomber plane. This was big news, and it didn't escape the Americans. In the US, they soon discovered that the British atomic bomb project was bigger and more advanced. Britain then told America that it could have access to any of its scientists and scientific research relating to the atomic bomb. But the problem for a while was that this research didn't always get to the right people in the USA. It was actually an Australian physicist, Mark Oliphant, who managed to visit the States and say, "Hey physicists, there is a lot of stuff you just haven't seen that those winging palms have been working on." We doubt he said it like that, but soon enough anyway, the American physicists had a lot to work with. Okay, so we'll have to cut a very long story into a shorter story. So we know lots of people were collaborating on this project from many places, and we know there was a very real fear that the Germans were ahead. Let's now think of the USA coming in and corralling all these scientists so they could communicate the work under one roof. This was by order of the president, and the military would take control of the project. Not that politicians or military men knew much about nuclear fission, so an American physicist called Robert Oppenheimer was made director. He's sometimes called the father of the atomic bomb, but as we said, this was a complicated endeavor and there was no one inventor. This project was codenamed the Manhattan Project by the American military, but also had the official codename of Development of Substitute Materials. One of those names would stick. The race was on. This is how General Leslie Groves and the Chief of Foreign Intelligence for the Manhattan Project explained why this race was so important. The Manhattan Project was built on fear. Fear that the enemy had the bomb, or would have it before we could develop it. The scientists knew this to be the case because they were refugees from Germany, a large number of them, and they had studied under the Germans before the war broke out. Another leading scientist on the project said this: "I think everyone was terrified that we were wrong and that the Germans were ahead of us. Germany led the civilized world of physics in every aspect. At the time war set in, when Hitler lowered the boom, it was a very frightening time." The thing is, all these people couldn't have been further from knowing the truth. They were leaps ahead of the Germans, and that's partly because they had some of the best German scientists who had all defected on board. Still, the Manhattan Project had to be huge and it was costly. It's said in all about 130,000 people worked on it, and it cost about $2 billion. That might not sound like much, but it would be somewhere in the region of $25 billion in today's money. For the Germans and the Allies, the problem was creating something out of extremely difficult to create raw materials that could be dropped from the sky and then detonated. This was no easy task, and huge factories and labs had to be built to make it a reality. As one German scientist said after he'd heard about Hiroshima, it must have taken factories large as the United States to make that much uranium-235. Just so you know, the first bomb was dropped by parachute from a US B-29 bomber called Enola Gay. The bomb exploded 600 feet above the ground. At the point of the explosion, the air temperature was around 1 million degrees Celsius. On the ground at the hypocenter, the temperature was between 3,000 and 4,000 degrees Celsius. A mushroom cloud rose about 10,000 feet. A fascinating thing to see to some people from far away, but below lay the ruins of a Japanese city and its scorched and dead inhabitants. A few minutes before that, lots of people were said to be looking up at the sky, wondering what those bombers were doing. We tell you this because in the 1940s, this is exactly what the scientists were trying to create. For years, materials were collected and scientists worked on how to create this bomb. In 1942, two plants built reactors to create plutonium, and also electromagnetic centrifuge and gaseous diffusion plants were built to produce uranium-235. In 1943, raw materials were very much being created, but then bomb design had to be thought about. In 1944, bomb models were tested, and later that year, dummy bombs called pumpkins were dropped in tests. In early 1945, leaders Roosevelt, Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin all met to discuss the imminent end of the war. Not long after the American leader died, his last words were, "I have a terrific headache." A few months later, and a plutonium implosion bomb was tested in New Mexico. The new President Truman then told Stalin that America had an ace in the hole, a bomb like no other. On July 26, President Truman, Chinese President Chiang Kai-shek, and the new British Prime Minister Clement Attlee issued the Potsdam Proclamation to Japan, asking that the country give up the fight and surrender. A few days later, and Japan replied, "No." As you know, on August 6th, the little man was dropped, and 3 days later, Nagasaki was hit. On August 14th, Japan surrendered. That's the end of the Manhattan Project, a multilingual global project that cost a ton of money and human life. In case you're wondering how all that science fit into one place at the end of the day, it goes a bit like this. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima acted a bit like a gun. It was tube-shaped with half of a nuclear charge at one end and the other half, the moving part, at the other end. A normal explosive charge was put behind the moving part, and you might say that was the near end of the barrel. When the charge was detonated, the bullet went down the tube and hit the charge at the other end, sometimes called the spike. Then the two halves of the nuclear materials were brought together and held together, and the result of this was a chain reaction. The fuel became what's called supercritical, and the explosion came next. The Manhattan Project was both a success and a bloody wart on the history of mankind. Some might say these weapons of mass destruction might have prevented other wars, but that's a debate we're not going to get into today. We'll leave you with the words of Oppenheimer: "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." They say that if you look hard enough, you can find just about anything you want on the internet. And if it's not on the internet, then it's probably either on the dark web or the deep web. This is where savvy internet users could access the now infamous Silk Road internet marketplace, described as the eBay of Vice. Silk Road connected buyers and sellers who were interested in exchanging everything from weapons to drugs, and quite a few things in between. But just what was this most notorious internet site of all time really about? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at the rise and fall of dark web's Silk Road. The deep web is made up of all the internet sites not indexed by search engines, with estimates saying that this deep web is actually many times larger than the real internet. It's not exactly hidden, but if you're a normal internet user, you simply can't find it because your search engines don't know how to. It's kind of like having a map with only one destination on it. You can't see all the branches and forks in the road that lead to other destinations because they aren't written on their map. Lurking below even this deep web, though, is the infamous dark web, a place where you need special software to actually access. These websites notoriously tend to operate outside of the law and are home to many of the digital horror stories we sometimes see come to light. Few dark web websites, though, were as well known or infamous as Silk Road, a digital marketplace. Silk Road connected buyers and sellers who used Bitcoin to exchange goods and services, which were almost overwhelmingly illegal. To access this hidden marketplace, a user needed a client such as a Tor Onion network, a software program ironically developed by the US Navy that enables online anonymity. But what was the Silk Road really about? Silk Road was developed by Ross "Dread Pirate" Roberts Ulbricht, a young, self-described libertarian with a degree in physics from the University of Texas and a master's in engineering from Pennsylvania State University. After graduating, Ulbricht became a research assistant at his alma mater, but after deciding he didn't want to be a full-time scientist, he tried to form a number of startups, including an online bookstore. None of these attempts panned out, however, and Ulbricht took his talents to Silicon Valley, hoping to join the digital startup community. Skeptical of the government's war on drugs and holding strong libertarian views, Ulbricht developed an online marketplace in 2011, which he named after the historical trade route network that linked Europe to East Asia, the Silk Road. Ulbricht claimed to have started this marketplace of vice with a noble purpose, wanting to make the world a better place and to use economic theory as a means to abolish the use of coercion and aggression among mankind. A completely unregulated and free market, Ulbricht wanted to empower users to decide for themselves what they wanted to put into their bodies, as well as save them the danger of having to deal with shady drug dealers or falling afoul of the law. The site matched buyers and sellers and even let users rate each other in order to build trust within this anonymous network. Transactions were to be made with Bitcoin, which, while not completely anonymous, were a great deal safer than using credit card transactions to buy illegal drugs with. While originally setting up the site, Ulbricht claimed that he wanted to restrict content to what he considered victimless crimes, though try telling a heartbroken family just how victimless a crime is to enable a serious and destructive drug habit. Listings to child pornography, stolen credit cards, assassinations, and weapons of mass destruction were banned, and a survey in 2013 showed that 70% of all listings were indeed for drugs. As the site grew in popularity and began generation of more cash, however, Ulbricht, as so often is the case for self-described idealists, began to relax the policies he set in place, and weapons began to be sold on the site, claiming that his choice was brought on by increasing regulations on firearm purchases, which clashed with his idealistic libertarian views. Ulbricht offered no explanation for why other contraband products also began to grow, to include the sale of child pornography. Perhaps Silk Road had grown too big for Ulbricht, or perhaps the millions in cash he was earning spoke louder than his stated principles. It might seem nuts to buy your drugs online and have them mailed to your house, but Silk Road provided a level of anonymity which protected its users for years. Even as the FBI launched a full-scale investigation, buyers and vendors could rate each other based on quality, reliability, and price, which helped spark confidence from other users. Orders were nearly always fulfilled, with the exception of the rare cases where the authorities intercepted a shipment. And even if intercepted, the recipients could simply feign ignorance as to why this package of drugs or guns or child porn was being delivered to them. With no digital link to the site, no law enforcement could produce charges against a customer for simply receiving a package in the mail. Over $1 billion flowed through Silk Road during its lifetime. Ulbricht would go on to make an estimated $28 million by the time he was arrested. Authorities were aware of Silk Road within just months of its launch, but a focused investigation would take over 2 years to uncover Ulbricht's real identity. Law enforcement had to try and infiltrate the network, then slowly track down suppliers and administrators on a one-by-one basis. Unfortunately for law enforcement, none of Silk Road's admins had ever learned Ulbricht's real name. However, over time, the FBI gradually flipped Ulbricht's closest associates and drew nearer to their quarry. Ironically, for a man who created an entire online marketplace that sold illegal goods and depended on complete anonymity and secrecy, Ulbricht himself would not be discovered by a flipped informant. but by his own digital carelessness. A simple Google search of Ulbricht's handle, Dread Pirate Roberts, revealed a connection to another alias called Altoid that had been an early promoter of Silk Road on another drug forum. That alias was then traced to a Bitcoin forum where Ulbricht had long ago posted his personal email address. Not exactly a pro move on Ulbricht's behalf. Though Ulbricht long professed his hopes to use Silk Road to make the world a better place and help people by letting them avoid dealing with dangerous drug dealers, Ulbricht's hypocrisy was revealed in the final stages of the investigation against him. During the FBI's investigation, they revealed the identity of a Curtis Green, a middle-aged father of two who worked as a seller and moderator on the site. Arrested by the FBI, Ulbricht feared that Green would become an informant, and without hesitation, this libertarian idealist, who just wanted to help people, immediately contacted another associate and asked him to kill Green for him. This associate, now known as Knob, turned out to be a DEA agent who had infiltrated Silk Road, and using the opportunity to get closer to Ulbricht, Knob staged the killing of Curtis Green after receiving a sum of $40,000. After the faked assassination, Ulbricht expressed remorse, but said that it had been necessary. If Ulbricht hoped to convince anyone of his doe-eyed, innocent pragmatism, however, it wouldn't work, as evidence later revealed that Ulbricht had attempted numerous times to hire assassins to kill others on his behalf, once even trying to hire a member of the Hells Angels to kill a Silk Road user that was blackmailing Ulbricht by launching a denial of service attack against Silk Road. Ulbricht would ultimately be exposed as another greedy fraud, his lofty morals and ideals immediately disregarded the moment profits started to be generated, even going so far as trying to murder people to protect his profits. A U.S. court would go on to hand Ulbricht double life sentences with no possibility of parole for his role in one of the largest drug trades the world has ever seen. With charges of money laundering, computer hacking, and drug trafficking, Ross Ulbricht claimed to want to help people and make the world a better place, but ultimately, all he did was allow criminal enterprises actively hurting and killing people to easily launder millions of dollars in cash, enable self-destructive addicts around the world to continue their terrible addictions, enable the victimization and exploitation of children to be used as sex slaves in online videos, and put guns in the hands of criminals. Claiming to foster libertarian values and protesting what he considered government overreach, Ulbricht ultimately would be exposed as a fraud, interested in nothing more than keeping the power he had earned and all that money that came with it, no matter who got hurt or who he had to kill to do it.
The term cult refers to a social group defined by its religious, spiritual, or philosophical beliefs, or its common interest in a particular personality, object, or goal. Religions tend to follow beliefs that are published openly in books such as the Bible, Quran, or Bhagavad Gita, whereas a cult relies on secret knowledge revealed only to members by the cult's founder and leader. In a cult, everything depends on a personal relationship between the founder and his or her followers, who are required to separate themselves from the rest of the world, often being bound to prophecies with a dark apocalyptic ending. That's what we'll investigate today in this episode of the infographic show, What Really Happened in Waco, Texas. April this year marked the 25th anniversary of one of the strangest and most tragic incidents in American religious history, when a bloody siege ended between FBI agents and members of the Branch Davidian religious group in Waco, Texas. The siege had dragged on for 51 days, and during that time, the FBI negotiators had continued to seek an agreement with sect leader David Koresh. 33-year-old Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, came from a dysfunctional family background. Koresh told the FBI during the late-night negotiation chats that he was a lonely child teased by other kids who called him Vernie. But to himself and to his followers in the Branch Davidian sect, Koresh was the almighty Lamb of God, commanding men to surrender their wives to him, fathering babies with girls as young as 12, and preparing his followers for the imminent apocalypse. While Koresh was the leader of the cult, the story of the Davidians begins several decades before his ascent to leadership. The group, also known as Shepherd's Rod, is an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists, a Christian religious group that today boasts roughly 19 million members worldwide. Unlike regular Christians, though, they believe that the Messiah prophesied in the biblical book of Isaiah was not Jesus, but was yet to come, as was the apocalypse. After 51 days, the the FBI's negotiations had hit a wall, with Koresh responding with everything from cracking jokes to threatening to start World War III, and much of it delivered using the scriptures, in particular the Book of Revelation. On the morning of Monday, April 19, 1993, with the FBI team still divided about whether negotiation could succeed, they eventually gave in and decided force was the best way to end the siege. Several hours were spent firing military-grade tear gas into the building before FBI armored vehicles moved in. Things took a turn for the worse just after noon, when the main building was engulfed in flames. Strong winds saw the fire spread fast, and the flames destroyed the biblically named Mount Carmel Center, part of the Davidians' compound. Byron Sage, head of the FBI negotiating team in Waco, called over the loudspeaker system, "You know, David, don't do this to those people. This is not the way to end this." But on that fateful day, 76 Davidians, including Koresh, died. More than 20 of them were children, some killed by smoke inhalation and others by falling debris as the fire destroyed the building. Only 9 sect members emerged alive. There have always been questions around those last few hours at Waco. Did the FBI and the Justice Department contribute in some way to that apocalyptic ending by applying too much pressure onto the Davidians, or were they somehow responsible for causing the fire? Independent filmmaker Michael McNulty found a shell casing from a certain type of tear gas round that could have started a fire. That evidence pointed towards the FBI potentially being responsible. The Justice Department had denied using this type of tear gas for more than 6 years, but after pressure from Johnston, who, for several weeks, wrote to his superiors warning them that the new evidence contradicted what they had been saying, Attorney General Janet Reno eventually admitted that the tear gas round had been used. So the FBI was caught in a lie. Though credible experts still overwhelmingly believe the Davidians started the fire, the admission breathed life into conspiracy theories that surround the Waco case. Who actually caused the fire has remained a point of contention, although an independent arson investigation concluded the fire was started from within the building. Another area of contention is who fired the first bullet. Gunfire broke out on the compound when agents arrived with arrest and search warrants. There was evidence that the Davidians were illegally stockpiling weapons. In fact, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms believed the community had nearly 250 weapons, including semi-automatic rifles, assault rifles, shotguns, revolvers, pistols, and hundreds of grenades. So could the gunfire have started on the inside? Amid the chaos, Koresh called 911 to report the shooting, but a transcript of the call remains inconclusive as to who exactly started firing first. Eyewitness reports are often the best way to find out what really happened. ABC News ran an article earlier this year with statements by some of the 9 survivors of the 1993 tragedy. The tank came into the front doors, the 2 double doors, and they just blew everything back. It was amazing to see a tank come through your living room, said Waco survivor and former Branch Davidian member David Thibodeau, who was inside the compound when the agents stormed the place. Those inside say the tanks destroyed the interior staircases, trapping many on the second floor. Thibodeau says he barely escaped. The wall started to catch fire, and I could feel the heat. It singed the side of my face. I could hear my hair crackle. Former Davidian David Bunz said Koresh wouldn't let his own children go, as he believed he was the next Messiah, and so his children were special and born from the message of God. Bunz also believed Koresh had started it on purpose to be in control of the situation, but Clive Doyle, another Davidian inside during the siege, said he wasn't sure. "I didn't see where it started, or who lit it or didn't light it, whether it was an accident, whether it was deliberate. There were no gas masks for the children, so the parents were soaking towels in buckets of water." They say that everybody who was alive at the time remembers the day it happened, and that it was one of the most shocking events in recent American history. A president rides along in an open-top limousine on a bright November day in Dallas, Texas. The sound of gunfire rips through the air, and onlookers are horrified as the most powerful man in America slumps forward. The day that changed history was followed by some of the most widely believed conspiracy theories of modern times. The bizarre chain of deaths following the presidents did little to quash these conspiracy theories. But what do we know happened, and what do we have yet to learn about the events of that fateful day? That's what we're about to find out. In this episode of the Infographic Show, what do we know and not know about the JFK assassination? Dallas, Texas, November 22nd at 12:30 p.m. The 35th President of the United States is fatally shot as he rides in his open-top limousine. He was announced dead at Parkland Memorial Hospital. Former US Marine and communist Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested by the Dallas police about 70 minutes after the shooting and charged under Texas state law with the murder of John F. Kennedy. In a strange twist, 2 days later, with live television cameras filming, Oswald was fatally shot at police headquarters by Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner. Oswald was taken to Parkland Memorial Hospital where he was pronounced dead, and Ruby was convicted of Oswald's murder and died in prison 4 years later. A 10-month investigation by the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone in killing JFK, who was the fourth American president to be assassinated. The others were Lincoln, Garfield, and McKinley. A 1964 report also concluded that 1. The shots were fired from the 6th floor window at the southeast corner of the Texas School Book Depository. 2. The shots were fired by Lee Harvey Oswald. And 3. There's no evidence that either Lee Harvey Oswald or Jack Ruby were part of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign. In a 1979 Warren Commission, the United States Select Committee on Assassinations concluded that Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. An analysis of audio recordings suggests that a second gun was used during the incident. John F. Kennedy's assassination is still subject to across-the-board debate and is one of the most prevalent conspiracy theories today. New documents relating to the event are currently being released by America's current president, Donald Trump. A poll conducted from 1966 to 2004 discovered that up to 80% of Americans still suspect that there was some sort of plot or cover-up. Some people believe that a second gunman fired from the grassy knoll as the president's open-top limousine passed. Jefferson Morley, a former Washington Post reporter who has written several books on the incident, says, "I've never written about a conspiracy theory. I report facts about the assassination. Look at the Zapruder film," he says in reference to home footage of the event. Kennedy's head goes flying backwards. I know there's a theory that if you get hit by a bullet from behind, the head goes towards the source of the bullet. But as a common sense explanation, it seems very unlikely. That sure looks like a shot from the front. What do we know about Oswald? He was born on October 18, 1939, and was an American Marxist and ex-Marine. He lived in the Belarusian city of Minsk in the Soviet Union from October 1959 to June 1962. He returned to the United States with his Russian wife Marina and eventually settled in Dallas. So, what don't we know about the assassination? Well, the fact that nobody kept a written record of Oswald's interview alerts suspicion and leaves much unknown. Every policeman involved violated standard procedures on interviewing detainees. In the 1960s, notes were always kept. But for some reason, these records have gone missing. This was the assassination of the most powerful man in America, and standard protocols were not followed? There's one hell of an information gap right there. But just why do onlookers shout conspiracy anyhow? Why would the government kill its own president? Well, it seems JFK was planning to withdraw from Vietnam and the Cold War, and the theory goes that too many corporations had begun to depend on the war economy and would have suffered huge losses had JFK continued on his peaceful trip. That's one of the theories. But the bizarre red flags are what really keep the conspiracy theorists chomping at the bit. Red flags such as the one raised by Jack Ruby's lone wolf attack on Oswald in a police basement. Why would he do it? Is such an attack not simply suicide? And then the sudden death of Ruby a few years later also raises suspicion. Had the Secret Service visited Ruby in jail? Was he ready to talk? Then there's that photo of Oswald that did the rounds in the press after his arrest. It was thought that the image of Oswald holding a rifle published in the press was in fact a faked image. An image of Oswald's face was superimposed onto the body of another man. Although the faked photo claim has been debunked by experts, the red flag remains in people's consciousness. Then there's the Umbrella Man. A figure holding an umbrella on that tragic sunny day is thought by some conspiracy theorists to be signaling to a gunman or gunmen. The Umbrella Man was caught on a home video recording of the event and added to the conspiracy myth. In 2017, the US government released 2,800 previously classified files related to the assassination, and we can conclude from those pages the following. The FBI warned Dallas police of a threat to kill Oswald, according to a memo by Director J. Edgar Hoover, but the police in Dallas, for whatever reason, failed to protect him. The FBI Dallas division was trying to track Oswald down in the days leading up to the assassination. He was of interest to the Bureau, according to Cuban sources. Pages from the file indicate that Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby, operated a shady bar with no interference from the police department, according to an FBI informant who shared the information days after Ruby was shot dead. The informant also went on to say he was surprised that Ruby actually killed Oswald rather than simply wounding him in the leg to get publicity. On the 24th of November, Hoover had begun to fear about a conspiracy theory arising, stating, "The thing I am concerned about is having something issued so that we can convince the public that Oswald is the real assassin." There's two ways to read that memo. Either the head of the FBI is concerned that the real conspiracy plot will be unraveled, or he thinks that circumstances surrounding the death of the president are so bizarre it seems like a conspiracy.
A private passenger jet is flying north of Moscow when suddenly two loud bangs are heard by locals, and just a few minutes later, the jet is lying in a fiery conflagration on the ground. One of the men listed as a passenger on the plane is Yevgeny Prigozhin, known to most of the world as the man who led the Wagner Group rebellion against Vladimir Putin in June of 2023. But how did Prigozhin go from a criminal and a hot dog stand owner to one of Putin's long-term confidants and then come to openly rebel against him? What really caused the crash of Prigozhin's private jet? And most importantly, what will the Wagner Group do next? We dove into this situation as it was developing to find out more. Prigozhin's always been a shadowy figure. Not much is known about his childhood and teenage years in Russia, although by the time he was in his 20s, he was already involved in fairly serious crimes. This resulted in him going to prison for 9 years for robbery and fraud. After Prigozhin was released back to the streets of St. Petersburg in the 1990s, he decided to leave his life of crime behind, for a while anyway, and take a different path. In fact, a very different path, as he decided to open up a hot dog stand, eventually working his way up to setting up upscale restaurants throughout the city. One of his most famous frequent guests was none other than Vladimir Putin. Since success is all about who you know, especially in an oligarchy, Prigozhin's ties to Putin and his other high-profile Russian officials got him huge catering contracts for state services like schools and the army. However, food isn't all he was cooking up. Prigozhin eventually earned the nickname Putin Chef, partly because he provided catering to the Kremlin, but mostly thanks to the other operations he was setting up for the future Russian president. In addition to being involved with Russia's infamous Internet Research Agency, aka the Russian Trolls, spearheading disinformation campaigns online, Prigozhin was intimately involved in setting up the Wagner Group. While it might sound like a boring venture capital fund, the Wagner Group was actually in the business of recruiting private military, otherwise known as mercenaries, to work in Ukraine. Sources say it was named after Hitler's favorite composer. As you might have guessed about a mercenary group named after one of Hitler's favorite things, the Wagner Group did some pretty terrible things as an organization. Sponsored by the Russian state and co-founded by Dmitry Utkin, the Wagner Group commenced operations in 2014 in order to support the Russian annexation of Crimea by sending unofficial soldiers to invade the region, keep it guarded, and lend support to pro-Russian groups in other parts of Ukraine, including the Donbass. Who were these unofficial soldiers? Accounts vary, but it seems that even though the Wagner Group started with a whole lot of former Russian military in order to swell their ranks during the war in Ukraine, a good chunk of them were men recruited from jail. In June of 2023, Prigozhin himself stated there are 25,000 of us, though that number only includes those who have survived and are still serving. Prigozhin would offer imprisoned men pardons and a small sum of money in order for them to perform 6-month military rotations in Ukraine. Several journalists and Ukrainian civilians allege that the men of the Wagner Group have committed war crimes and unnecessary violence against civilians, winding an especially harsh road through eastern Ukraine. After Russia's initial military humiliation in its war against Ukraine, the Wagner Group actually helped Putin make several gains, but most importantly being responsible for taking the Ukrainian city of Bakhmut. So how did the relationship between Prigozhin and Putin sour? As the war in Ukraine went on longer than anyone expected, becoming costlier in terms of lives and money by the day, Prigozhin became increasingly irate at the Russian state's failure to adequately supply him and his men, directing his anger mostly at Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Then, Putin supported a state effort to make Russia's paramilitary groups, including the Wagner Group, sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. Prigozhin balked at the idea, refusing to cede control of his men to the state. Then, in the span of one long, confusing day on June 23rd, Prigozhin told the Russian people that the reasons for the war in Ukraine had always been a lie propagated by a small group of scumbags who had deceived both Putin and the people. Though he initially seemed loyal still to Putin, through this announcement, he later stated the official Russian military had attacked the men of the Wagner Group in Ukraine. The Russian state, of course, denied such a thing, and Prigozhin didn't really produce any proof of such an event, so no one knew who to believe between the two equally unbelievable sides. Nevertheless, he decided to start a long military march toward the Russian capital, which he saw as a march for justice, but Putin saw as, well, a rebellion and an invasion. Everyone who has been closely monitoring the competence of the Russian army will not be surprised to learn that Prigozhin entered military headquarters within 124 miles of the Moscow area and waltzed into the center of the city with little apparent resistance. A furious Putin addressed the nation on Russian television the next morning and stated the following: "What we are facing is precisely treason." He insisted that those who had rebelled against his authority in the military would pay. Prigozhin, curiously, still stated that he was loyal to Putin and simply vehemently disagreed with the other members of the state's defense apparatus. But after Putin's television address, he seemed to aim his anger at Putin as well. A quick and out-of-left-field intervention by Belarusian leader and Putin ally Alexander Lukashenko seemingly stalled a quickly spiraling situation in Russia. Lukashenko would offer Prigozhin safe haven in Belarus, where he would avoid criminal charges as long as he stopped his march against Putin and the Russian leadership. Any members of the Wagner Group who wanted to officially sign with the Russian Defense Ministry could do so, otherwise they were free to go. This quick and seemingly peaceful resolution puzzled leaders and journalists worldwide. Would Putin and the Russian government, known for its apparently very clumsy detractors experiencing frequent defenestrations and quite coincidental radiation poisonings, let such a challenge to their rule go unpunished? Was Prigozhin really safe and free? Would he disappear, or would he continue in other ways to challenge the Russian state? Well, the answer seemingly came last month. Though earlier in the week, Prigozhin had released a video which showed him in Africa. On Wednesday evening, he was on the passenger list of an Embraer jet flying from Moscow to St. Petersburg, about 200 miles north of Moscow. While crossing the Tver region, locals heard two loud bangs, and video footage showed the small passenger jet plummeting toward the ground with smoke billowing out behind it. Eventually, the plane crashed and broke out into flames. 10 people were listed on the manifest, 7 passengers and 3 crew members, including Prigozhin and Wagner Group co-founder Dmitry Utkin. So far, Utkin, along with a few other people on board the plane, including pilots Alexei Levshin and Rustem Karamov and flight attendant Kristiana Raspopova, have been confirmed dead. Another close associate of Prigozhin's, Valery Chekalov, was also rumored to be on the flight, along with 3 other members of the Wagner Group. This is according to Russia's investigative body, the Dossier Center. Reports seem to confirm that the jet with tail number RA02795 is in fact the one frequently used by Prigozhin, including in his escape from Russia to Belarus in June. As one might suspect, after watching the fiery footage of the plane on the ground, Russian officials confirmed that all 10 people on board the jet had died. But how? Channels associated with the Wagner Group, including the group's unofficial Telegram channel Grey Zone, have already started reporting that air defense missiles brought the plane down. Though a definite possibility, it is likely that civilian radar would have seen air defense missiles careening toward the plane. Of course, a corrupt Russian state might have covered up or in some way disabled this radar in order to avoid exactly this type of detection. Another potential option is that explosives were attached to one or both of the wings, as in early footage it appears that the wing of the plane has been sheared off. In addition, the 2 loud bangs civilians heard on the ground may be attributable to bombs going off in the air. A third, and seemingly unlikely but still plausible option is that the jet might have actually just crashed. Most of the world has imposed sanctions on Russia since its invasion of Ukraine, which has impacted every part of Russian life, from the economy to food supplies. Understandably, Russian planes have been impacted as well, as the state has started to cannibalize old planes for parts to use in the rest of their fleet, creating an extremely treacherous situation in the air for Russian flights. The official cause of the crash has not yet been confirmed, and it is likely that with the Kremlin and the Russian state in charge of the investigation, who are strongly suspected of obtaining revenge on Prigozhin by killing him in his plane crash, the official story of the plane crash will likely be dishonest, so we won't have a definite, real answer for a while, though U.S. intelligence is currently leaning toward explosives planted on the plane. What we will have is real reactions, with the Wagner Group immediately declaring that Russia air defense systems brought down the plane. It's becoming clear that they will not let the assassination of their leader go unpunished. Overextended and exhausted in Ukraine, the Russian military will face a real problem if the many men of the Wagner Group refuse to bolster their military effort. Furthermore, the soldiers of the Wagner Group, some of whom already believed that Russian forces attacked them back in June, might launch an offensive against the Russian military itself, turning the Russian-Ukraine war into a civil war that will distract Russia from its objectives in Ukraine and force a retreat. Another option is that this may be the last straw in terms of the relationship deterioration between Putin and Wagner. Reports from Russia have painted a picture of Putin as increasingly paranoid about loyalty and assassination attempts since his invasion of Ukraine. If he has indeed killed the man that openly revolted against him, the man who led a 25,000-strong mercenary army, it would seem Putin has all the more reason to panic and fear for his life. Putin will try to possibly shift the blame for Prigozhin's death to someone else. The Kremlin is known for refusing to take responsibility for its extrajudicial crimes and leading plenty of false flag attacks over the years to justify the invasion or attack of a neighboring state or political group. Will Putin blame Ukraine? The US? Even for the Kremlin, this would seem difficult to pitch and sell, as Ukraine and the Western world would have little reason to assassinate a threat and a traitor to the Russian state, especially within Russian borders. So it seems like Putin will have to, in some ways, maintain accountability for this death. He may even own it proudly, as he did publicly threaten that any traitor to the Russian state would pay for his crimes, and killing Prigozhin might make him seem like he's back in control of his crumbling state and military. The strange thing is, it still remains officially unconfirmed if Prigozhin was actually on the plane. Though he is associated with this jet and his name was on the passenger list, it would be an incredibly dangerous idea for Prigozhin to fly between two of the biggest Russian cities just 2 months after his revolt against the state, especially after Putin called him a traitor. Is it possible that Putin and Prigozhin brokered a separate deal, where Putin could save face in front of the Russian people by declaring Prigozhin dead, while Prigozhin would be quietly allowed to remain dead for all intents and purposes and live his life safely somewhere far, far away? Though this has been suggested by some commentators regarding the crash, the reaction of the Wagner Group makes it seem increasingly unlikely. Their rush to blame the defense systems of the Russian state make it appear as though an escalation in conflict between the Wagner Group and the Russian state and military is happening, and soon. If Prigozhin was in on the faking of his own death, it's likely that people higher up in the Wagner Group would be aware as well. One thing that additionally remains unclear is why so many high-ranking members of the ranking group would be traveling together on the small same private plane within Russian borders, especially knowing that Putin harbors a significant grudge against them. The leaders of the Wagner Group have always been incredibly careful about their security for obvious reasons, so why make such a seemingly obvious and apparently fatal blunder? The death of Wagner chief Prigozhin may ironically point to a light at the end of the tunnel for the Ukrainian people, as the resulting political turmoil and military infighting in Russia is likely to lead to a big retreat from the front in Ukraine, though no one can say for sure at this point. However, no matter which way things go, almost one thing is certain: the likely assassination of Prigozhin signals dark days for Russia and its people ahead, not to mention a potential civil conflict within its borders. The White Forest crawled with Soviet soldiers. The men moved through the trees silently, wading through nearly waist-deep snow. Each breath froze on their faces, leaving their eyelashes tipped with white. It was easily below -30°C, the coldest conditions a lot of these men had ever experienced. Their commanding officer, walking in the middle of the squadron, fell into the snow face first. A split second later, a bang ripped through the trees. "Sniper!" The cry went up but was immediately silenced by another bullet, followed a moment later by a bang. The men scattered in all directions, diving behind trees and rocks, staring out ahead of them to spot where the enemy soldier was hiding. There were 25 of them in the squad, more than enough to take down one Finnish gunman. But as hard as each of them looked, no one could see where the shots were coming from. There was no barrel smoke, not a glint on a scope, not even a puff of air from the man breathing. It was like they were fighting a ghost. The bullets continued to whiz through the forest, one after another, with almost perfect regularity. Each one was followed by a loud, echoing crack. The men laid down flat, totally behind cover. There was no way a sniper in front of them could possibly pick them off, but one by one the men kept slumping in the snow dead. Cries of panic echoed around the group. Where was their killer hiding? Some of the soldiers lost their cool and tried to run away through the snow, only to fall to the ground after just a couple of steps. Bullet after bullet flew through the trees until there was just one soldier left, cowering behind a rock. How could the sniper be shooting them all from up ahead? Unless the bullet finished him off before his mind finished putting the pieces together. A few minutes later, a patch of snow rustled, and a short Finnish man stood up, alone in the woods. He was 150 feet behind the Soviets, They'd all walked right past him without even noticing. There was no scope on his rifle, just the iron sights. He spat the last bits of snow out of his mouth and watched as his breath curled into steam again. Very calmly, Simo Hayaha, the White Death, packed away his equipment and walked back to camp. It's difficult to say who won the Winter War. 3 months into the chaos of the Second World War, shrouded by conflicts erupting all across Europe, the Soviet Union launched an invasion of Finland. 3 months, 1 week, and 6 days later, the war was over. Finland had lost 25,904 soldiers, as well as 11% of its land. The Soviets, victorious, had lost between 126,875 and 167,976 soldiers. On average, every Finnish person who died took down 6 Soviets with them. On paper, the Soviets should have steamrolled this small country. Their military strength dwarfed that of their Nordic neighbors, and yet they struggled to make any meaningful progress all winter. The Soviets walked away from this war, having been embarrassed on the world stage. But how? For starters, the history of the two countries has always been closely tied. The Northern Crusades in the late 13th century saw Finland being absorbed into the Swedish Empire, where it remained for centuries. That was until 1809, when the Russian Empire grew uncomfortable with the Swedes having such close access to the Russian capital of St. Petersburg. Russia captured and annexed Finland, releasing it from one empire directly into the clutches of another, as it then became the Grand Duchy of Finland, an autonomous state ruled by the Russian Empire. Yet Finland wasn't just a patch of Swedish land or Russian land. It had people with a unique language, culture, mythology, and history. Finland had culture. What the Russians failed to anticipate at this point was the explosion of Finnish culture and national identity that would take place under their rule. Freed from the Swedes and given some level of autonomy, the Finnish people had never before felt so Finnish. Soon enough, they began to ask the question of whether they wanted to be a country in their own right. Russia, realizing what was happening, attempted to assimilate Finland into its empire in the 19th century, but failed, which only further stoked the fires of Finnish independence. Then in 1917, the Russian Empire collapsed entirely, giving Finland a sudden opportunity to secede. Finland capitalized and gained their independence in a matter of months, but their future as a nation was still uncertain. The conservative Finns, known as the Whites, who were pushing for independence, were met with fierce opposition from the pro-Russian Reds. A bloody civil war threatened to divide the new country before it even got going. This could be a whole video in itself, but we'll give you the main events. In the midst of the chaos, a former Russian lieutenant general by the name of Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim took leadership of the Whites' military. Thanks in large part to his leadership, 4 months later, the Finns clawed their way to peace. With the Whites victorious and standing at the dawn of their independence, Mannerheim was a hero. Another important detail from this period was how the Whites won the Civil War. Finland didn't previously have much of an established army of their own. No real equipment, structure, training, anything. But they needed it fast. One country, a close ally for many years, stepped in to help them and turned the tide of the Civil War: Imperial Germany. Jägers, the German word for hunters, and the term used for infantry, became jäkari in Finnish. The Whites modeled their military closely on the German structure and bought a number of weapons and vehicles to aid them in their victory over the Reds. In many ways, this conflict baked certain international relations into the country right from its inception that would become crucial to its decisions in the Second World War. Germany was seen as an ally, Russia was the enemy, but more on that later. Over the next couple of decades, Finland and Russia settled into a discontented peace, neither side particularly happy about having to share a border with their neighbor. Mannerheim rose even higher through the ranks within Finland, ending up in the position of chairman of the Finnish Defense Council. When given the role in 1931, it came with a warning. It was only a matter of time before war would erupt with the Soviets. Tensions were rising steadily year on year. One particular point of contention for both countries was the border itself, specifically Karelia. This was a piece of land divided in half by the border between the two countries. Historically, it had been Finnish until the Swedes had given the land to the Russian Empire. So once the dust settled from their independence, both countries felt they had a claim to Karelia, but only actually owned half of it. For Finland, it was a point of heritage and identity. There were Finnish people living in East Karelia on the Russian side of the border who should have been unified with the rest of their people. A lot of the Finns in Russian East Karelia agreed with this. Why were they suddenly living in a country different from their ancestors and having to speak a different language? For the Soviets, it was a point of national security. The city of Leningrad was only 20 miles from the Finnish border, and in that stretch of land, there was a growing number of nationalistic Finns. Given Finland's close ties with Germany, The 1930s saw the impending outbreak of World War II intensifying these threats. Stalin was worried. What if Nazi Germany convinced Finland to join the war and allow them to launch an invasion through Karelia? After all, the Finns already liked the Germans and hated the Soviets, remember? Stalin knew he had to act fast. War in Europe was about to break out at any moment, and he couldn't be caught unprepared. What followed in the late 1930s was a period of intense negotiations. Representatives of both countries regularly met with one another in the months leading up to the Second World War. The Soviets came in with their most minimal request, bolstered by the attendance of Joseph Stalin himself, in an attempt to underline the importance of the deal. Stalin was friendly and lit up with smiles and goodwill toward the Finnish delegates. He suggested that the Finns give them Karelia in exchange for some more land toward the north of the border. That would allow him to put more space between Leningrad and his potential enemies, as well as take ownership of a number of islands and establish a naval base in the Gulf of Finland. Mannerheim knew the Finnish military better than anyone and pushed for them to accept the deal. In his eyes, they had no choice. The Soviets negotiating peacefully was Stalin offering an olive branch. If the Finns said no, they wouldn't stand a chance against the invading Red Army. But the Finnish government, assuming that the Soviets had come in with their most audacious request, tried to negotiate them down and refused to budge. They were nervous but rebutted Stalin's offers, waiting for him to back off. They knew they didn't have the military power to fight off the Soviets, not by a long shot, but public distrust of Russia and a strong reluctance to give up any of the land they'd fought so hard to gain meant the talks reached a stalemate. The Finnish parliament eventually voted no to the Russian demands, much to the surprise of Stalin, who asked jokingly if his votes could be included too. But from that point on, the Soviets stopped attending talks. Stalin had stopped joking around. On the 26th of November 1939, in a small village called Mainila on the Soviet side of the border, a small group of Soviet soldiers exploded. Stationed in a guard post minding their own business, the Soviets were shelled from the Finnish side of the border, totally unprovoked. That gave the Red Army all the reason they needed to ramp up their military presence at the border, something which they had been doing already, and prepare for war. Since the end of the war, historians on both sides have concluded that this event never actually happened. Neither country had any artillery stationed anywhere in range of the village at the time. Stalin had lied, using a false flag event as an excuse to invade Finland and take the land that he believed was rightfully his. At 8 a.m. on November 30th, 1939, the Red Army launched their attack. 500,000 Soviet soldiers stormed into Finland, a country that only had 3.6 million people in total. To make matters worse, another 500,000 Soviets were getting ready in reserve. They attacked along almost the entire length of the border, looking to exploit under-defended areas and overwhelm Finland immediately, perhaps inspired by the German invasion of Poland just a couple months earlier. Attack swiftly and from as many directions as possible, stretching the defensive line thin and relying on superior numbers to gain early momentum. And superior numbers they had. Stalin sent in over 450,000 soldiers to face 33,000 men in the Finnish National Army, 21 divisions of soldiers against just 3. The Red Army had thousands of aircraft and tanks at its disposal, while Finland had less than 70 aircraft and a dozen World War I-era French Renault tanks. What was more is the Soviets had spent months building rail links all the way up the length of the border to supply their troops with food, ammunition, and reinforcements. On top of all that, Stalin had a plan. Their attack would focus on 3 areas in particular. The Karelian Isthmus, which they knew would be the most heavily fortified part of the front, was also the most open, with a number of lakes that would freeze over in December, allowing the Soviets to move tanks and heavy artillery closer to the fortifications. They would fight the Finnish forces here, whilst attempting to flank them where they could, waiting for the rest of the country to fold. And fold it would, because at the top of the border, the Finnish landscape was wild and rural. They didn't anticipate heavy resistance that far out, as the land wasn't well supplied or particularly defensible. So they would send the smaller, less experienced 14th Army to attack the north. The army was tasked with targeting Lapland port of Petsamo and taking the town of Oulu on the Gulf of Bothnia. With those taken, Russia could cut off all foreign aid from reaching Finland from Sweden. And in the center was the key to their strategy. Their battle-hardened 9th Army would attack as a tight unit, slicing Finland in half and severing communications and infrastructure the whole way across. With that accomplished, they would push south, pincering the last of the Finnish defense in Karelia. After defeating those forces, they would push through, taking Viipuri, and then roll toward Helsinki, which would leave them defenseless. They'd destroy the Finnish resistance in no time. 12 days, to be exact. Lieutenant General Kirill Meretskov estimated the whole conflict to be over in 12 days. At that point, Russia then had to choose to either take the whole of Finland back into its control or just the key areas they identified before the war. But after a couple of days, it was clear that they had massively underestimated their foe. Remember how we said the Finnish army was just 33,000 soldiers? Well, that was true. Their official army was only that large. But unbeknownst to Russia, in the months leading up to the outbreak of the war, Finnish men had been signing themselves up for the reserve forces by the droves, under the guise of additional training. The Territorial Army bolstered its military strength to 127,000. They had another 100,000 in the reserves and then a further 100,000 in the Civic Guard. Supporting them were another 100,000 women of the Lotasvard, otherwise known as the Women's Auxiliary Army. Then all of a sudden, the Finnish resistance force wasn't looking too dissimilar to the 450,000 men of the Red Army. What's more, while Mannerheim had been keen to accept the peaceful route proposed by the Soviets, he'd also spent the last 8 years of his life preparing his country for this exact scenario. A veteran of World War I and the Russo-Japanese War, Mannerheim had distinguished himself in combat and strategy from a young age. The man was as seasoned a military commander as Finland could have hoped for, but he was not alone. Of the hundreds of thousands of Finnish men who served, many were combat veterans themselves, having fought in their own country during the Civil War and World War I. Mannerheim had the soldiers and the knowledge of how to use them effectively. So how did he plan to save Finland from the almost guaranteed defeat? His priority was to establish a fiercely strong front line at the Karelian Isthmus called the Mannerheim Line in his honor. There he stationed the bulk of his forces, while ensuring to place a good number of troops across the rest of the border all the way up to the Arctic Circle. Mannerheim anticipated the Soviet strategy well. The supposedly unstoppable force of the Red Army met the immovable object of the Finns. Fighting broke out amongst the snowy forests all along the border. The Soviets, dressed in their dark khaki uniforms, stood out like sore thumbs as they tried to push forward. In contrast, the Finns were dressed in all-white uniforms and set themselves up in foxholes and bunkers to the point that they were virtually invisible. Unsure where the enemy was and panicking, the Russians were picked off quickly without having much opportunity to retaliate. The Finnish strategy was simple: hold the line. Foreign support would eventually come from the UK, France, and Sweden, or Stalin would grow frustrated and broker peace. Until one of those things happened, the Finns wouldn't shift. And with a harsh winter bearing down on them, the Finnish soldiers had one mission: survive. And survive they did. Despite lacking the conventional vehicles of warfare, the Finns knew the land better than anyone and were keenly resourceful. Most of these men had grown up in the countryside where winters were harsh and living was tough. While the Russian soldiers were bogged down wading through waist-deep snow, the Finns used skis to get around quickly and quietly, as they had always done in the winters. The Jägers, Finland's elite soldiers, had bicycles that they would use to quickly traverse behind the front lines, allowing them to pop up in different spots and perform effective strikes on exposed targets. When tanks would roll through, Finnish men would jam logs into their tracks, effectively grounding the heavy vehicles. They would then light up Molotov cocktails and throw them at the exhaust vents, blowing out the engines and destroying the tanks. Several tons of Soviet engineering were brought down with some wood, alcohol, and a couple of glass bottles. And it wasn't the end of the Soviets' woes. In the 2 years leading up to the war, Stalin's unhinged paranoia led to him gutting the Red Army's leadership and replacing seasoned commanders with promoted rookies. The grand strategy in place may have been sound, but much of the middle tiers of the army were woefully out of their depth, especially against such an unconventional defensive force. They immediately experienced crippling traffic jams. The roads into the country were small and far apart, meaning they had to move single file and without the support of those parallel to them. The roads themselves were poor quality and ruined by extreme weather, not to mention the Finnish resistance. So even with 1,000 tanks ready to fight, the Soviets could barely get any of them into the country. Stuck in traffic jams, the Red Army couldn't fan out and thus were surrounded easily. With destroyed vehicles now blocking the few usable roads, these army columns were brought to an almost total standstill. Finland had littered the border with booby traps and mines, making the Soviets hesitant to stray from the main roads. The Finns also dotted lone snipers throughout the forests, men dressed all in white, who would lie in wait for hours on the lookout for potential targets. A single sniper was capable of delaying a Russian convoy for hours, as they were so difficult to detect and frighteningly accurate due to growing up hunting the Finnish forests. By far the most notorious of these snipers was the White Death himself, Simo Häyhä. Haya had grown up near Viipuri, the first city that the invading Red Army would take if the Mannerheim Line failed. For him, as was the case for almost all other Finns, this war was deeply personal, in stark contrast to most of the Soviets crossing the border who had little connection to the conquest of Finland. Throughout the conflict, Haya racked up over 500 kills, making him the most lethal marksman in military history, even though he was only in combat for less than 100 days. Haya would take up position first thing in the morning before daybreak and long before any enemies were expected to pass by. He would cover himself in as many layers as he could and lie flat in the snow with a small mound of snow in front of him. As the war dragged on, the temperatures would dip down to as low as -40. Yet Haya would lay there, waiting, snacking on bread and sugar to keep his body warm. Armed with the Seiko M2830, Haya opted to forego any kind of scope. He didn't want the glint to give away his position, or to have to raise his head to look through it. With the iron sights he'd grown so familiar with, he could keep hunkered down out of sight while still being accurate. It also helped that he was only 5 foot 3 inches. As the enemies approached, he would pack snow into his mouth so that his breath wouldn't steam up as it passed his lips and the rest of the barrel of the rifle on the snowy mound he built earlier to cool it and reduce the smoke trails from his shots. He'd sit there watching the enemy for a long time before firing, studying their movements, counting their numbers, and lulling them into a false sense of security. Then he'd pull the trigger. On the 21st of December, 1939, Haya achieved his highest daily count of 25 kills. The Finnish propaganda machine noticed and quickly drummed up a kind of mythology around the man. Everything about his character perfectly summed up what they wanted the Finnish spirit to be. But as a result, viewing him accurately through a historical lens is challenging. Haya gained the nickname White Death during the course of the war, which was supposedly what the Soviets would call him. That has since been debunked, and it's clear that the nickname came from within the Finnish ranks. Could the Finns have also been exaggerating his kill count for the sake of morale? Very possibly. The best evidence, however, for Haya's efficiency comes from his own private memoir. Haya did not write this for an audience, yet in the book he estimates that he killed around 500 people in what he calls his sin list. This was only published long after his death. Zooming back out, we can see a brutal winter covering the front line, freezing soldiers on both sides. Extreme conditions wrought havoc on the Red Army. Due to the scale of the invasion, much of the Soviet equipment was woefully out of date and in poor condition. Stalin had not invested enough resources in the decades prior to the war in outfitting an army as large as the one he fielded. In comparison, the basic but reliable Finnish weaponry and equipment performed well in the icy conditions. The Mannerheim Line was holding strong. Spanning 80 miles with 106 concrete structures built into it, the Finns had done everything they could to make life difficult for their enemy. Barbed wire laced through the forest in all directions, and hundreds of mines and granite blocks were sunk into any and all roads leading toward the front. The Soviets tried to fight through the line all December, first on the left near Taipale, then on the right at Soma, with no luck. The Finns had held such an advantageous position that even getting close to them was nearly impossible. That December, the Red Army experienced colossal casualties. They had lost thousands of men trying to break through with nothing to show for their efforts. More than 250 of their tanks had been destroyed at this point, and morale was slumping lower and lower by the day. The soldiers were freezing, under-equipped, fighting an enemy they couldn't get anywhere close to, and being mismanaged at every turn, leading to unnecessary losses on a daily basis. Meanwhile, north of Lake Ladoga, Finland achieved one of its most important and decisive victories in the war. Here, the weather conditions were even worse than at the Mannerheim Line. Without the focal point of dug-in fortifications, the Finns were able to use their superior maneuverability to their advantage and surrounded the flagging Russian soldiers. During the battle for Tolvajärvi, around 630 Finns lost their lives, but in doing so, they captured almost an equal number of prisoners and killed nearly 10 times as many, with even more injuries on top of that. The Soviets, panicking without clear instructions from above, didn't know what to do. Some retreated while others dug in, meaning those left behind were quickly surrounded and wiped out. The Finns even had a word for these pockets, motis, the piles of timber that they would come back to later to chop into more convenient sizes. The decisive rebuff of the Soviet offensive allowed the Finns to secure the middle of the country for the duration of the war. But further north it started to go wrong. The Soviets started to make gains, and while they were slowed down by skiing Finns with hit-and-run tactics, they couldn't be held back forever. The Soviets took the town of Suomussalmi for a few days until Finnish reinforcements from the 9th Division arrived to take it back. Surrounding the town, the Finns lured the Red Army into a retreat through the woods. Once in the cover of the trees, the stealthy Finnish ski troops attacked, making short work of the enemy. But the good news could only last so long. The advantage the Soviets had from the start of the war was what carried them through to victory. In February, they redoubled their efforts and corrected failing strategies. All of their focus went into the south as they worked to pierce the Mannerheim Line. Rather than sending vehicles charging through, they amassed them in large groups and crawled them forward slowly, surrounded by hordes of soldiers. The shelling was near constant. On February 1, 1940, more than 300,000 shells were fired at the Finns. As battle-hardened and ready as the Finns were, they'd also been there enduring the harsh winter just as the Soviets had, but without the luxury of reinforcements. They were exhausted and running low on supplies. Each subsequent day, the Soviets increased the pressure, sending through wave after wave of armored vehicles and soldiers. The country with the most casualties in the Second World War is by far and away the Soviets, with over 27 million deaths, a number that eclipses any other country in Europe by an enormous margin. A large part of this was Stalin's military strategy. Throw men at the problem. If they die, more will take their place. Like water eroding a cliff, eventually everything will break. And on February 11th, the Mannerheim Line broke. The Finns tried to fall back to the intermediate line, but it was too late. The Red Army finally had something it had been lacking all winter: momentum. They gained ground all the way through February and into March. Mannerheim at the start of the war had been relying on one thing to see his country through the war: foreign support. The Finns would hold the line and wait for an ally to give them equipment or backing needed to turn the tide. But as the Red Army moved further and further into Finland, with each passing day it became clear foreign aid would never arrive. On March 13th, the Finnish government requested a ceasefire. Their nation was battered and exhausted. The soldiers had nothing left to give, and there were no new soldiers to take their place. It was over. The Karelian Isthmus was given to the Soviets, along with the ports that they had requested prior to the war. The Finns had lost. But had they? At the start of the war, it looked inevitable that Finland would suffer a total defeat. The Soviets predicted victory in just 12 days. Yet here they were over 3 months later, only having lost around 11% of their land. They'd lost 25,904 soldiers, but had killed upwards of 160,000 Soviets, with around 100,000 more wounded. Just as the war was coming to a close, a story appeared in the newspaper declaring that Simo Häyhä had been hit in the face with an explosive round and that the Finnish war hero had died on March 6th. His body had been piled up with a number of other soldiers, further destroying the morale of the Finnish army. But that afternoon, the editor of the newspaper had a letter come across his desk. The sender politely explained that there was an error in his story that would need to be corrected. It was signed Simo Häyhä. The man had woken up on the 13th of March, the day that peace was declared. Now for a deeper dive into Simo Häyhä's life, check out The White Death, Best Sniper in History, or watch this video instead.